Name of the story: The Unclaimed Package. It was a cold morning when the package arrived. Catherine Spencer had always been the first to rise in her house, a habit she had inherited from her mother, who used to say that the world belonged to the early risers. It was the only peace she found, before the clutter of daily life, before the children stirred, before the noise of the world began to take shape. The house, a small two-story structure nestled on a quiet street in the town of Willow Creek, stood still under the pale morning sky. The quiet seemed eternal, as though nothing ever truly changed here. Yet, on that day, something was different. It wasn't the strange stillness of the morning. No, it was the package. Catherine had gone out to check the mail, as usual, wearing her oversized robe and slippers. The air felt damp against her skin, the faint scent of rain still lingering from the previous evening's storm. The driveway, lined with half-dead hydrangeas and an assortment of tangled vines, stretched out before her, still slick with morning dew. She shuffled across the front yard, taking a moment to glance at the neighbor's house, which stood eerily silent. There had been talk among the neighbors about the odd things that had been happening lately: disappearances, strange noises at night, and the growing tension in the air. But Catherine had always dismissed it as gossip, the kind of talk that would sprout up when people grew bored of their routines. It was nothing more than idle chatter, she thought, nothing more than the noise that would soon fade. But now, as she neared her mailbox, her breath caught in her throat. There, sitting on her front porch, was a package. No label, no return address, just a plain brown box, wrapped in cheap tape, its edges fraying as though it had been hastily put together. It was strange to her, because she hadn't ordered anything recently. Her family wasn't expecting any deliveries. The package was a complete mystery, sitting there innocently, waiting to be discovered. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sudden unease creep up her spine. A strange chill swept over her, despite the mild temperature. She had heard of these things, packages left on doorsteps, gifts that weren't really gifts. It was a story she had read about once, long ago, about a family who received something similar, only to find that it was tied to something far darker than they could have imagined. "Get a grip, Catherine," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "It's probably just a mistake, a wrong delivery." But something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite place. The box looked old, worn, as though it had been through something. The edges of the cardboard were battered, and the tape was peeling off in several places. There was no mistaking the fact that someone had sent it. But why? She took a cautious step toward the package, her slippers shuffling across the concrete. She crouched down, her fingers brushing lightly against the rough cardboard surface. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt, watched. The hairs weren't standing from the cold, but from something else, something that made her feel as though she was not alone. Tentatively, Catherine picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy, and her fingers trembled as she gripped it. For a moment, she thought about simply leaving it there, going back inside, and pretending it didn't exist. But that would mean ignoring the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to hang over her, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Instead, she took the box inside, placing it carefully on the kitchen counter. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Her mind flipped through the possibilities: a mistake, an anonymous gift, a prank. She didn't know, but there was something about it that felt wrong, something that made her stomach churn. "Mom!" The voice of her daughter, Emily, echoed from the hallway, snapping Catherine from her thoughts. "What's that?" Emily, a curious and lively 10-year-old, bounded into the kitchen, her blonde hair bouncing with each step. She stopped short when she saw the package, her wide brown eyes locking onto it. "I don't know," Catherine replied, her voice unsteady. It just showed up on the porch. Are we going to open it? Emily asked, her tone laced with excitement. Catherine hesitated. The last thing she wanted was for Emily to be involved in whatever was going on with that package. But she couldn't just leave it there either. It was strange, unnerving, and now she felt the need to understand what was inside. We'll open it together, Catherine said, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She reached for the tape, peeling it away, each rip of the plastic sound far too loud in the quiet of the house. The box was packed with layers of crumpled newspaper. She pulled it aside, piece by piece, until she finally reached the object hidden inside. It was an old wooden box, no larger than a shoebox. It looked ancient, with intricate carvings etched into the dark wood. The design was unsettling, a swirling pattern that seemed to move in the light, almost as though it was alive. Catherine's fingers brushed against it, and she felt a strange warmth radiate from the box. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she felt a deep, gnawing sense of foreboding. The box had an air of malevolence to it, something dark and sinister. Mom, what is it? Emily's voice trembled, sensing her mother's unease. I don't know, Catherine replied, her voice quiet, almost afraid. I'm not sure. She lifted the box carefully, and as she did, something else fell out of the crumpled newspaper, a small, tattered note. Catherine unfolded it, the paper crackling under her fingertips. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, almost as though the writer was desperate. Do not open the box. The words were written in red ink, smeared and uneven, as if someone had been in a hurry. A chill ran down Catherine's spine as she read the note. Her hands shook, and for a moment she thought about throwing the box away, ignoring it completely. But something kept her from doing so, something in the back of her mind, a whisper that told her she had to know. She had to understand. But what was it about the package that made her feel this way? What does it mean, Mom? Emily asked again, her voice small, frightened. I don't know, Catherine repeated. But we're going to figure it out. With trembling hands, she set the box on the kitchen table. She turned it over, examining every inch of its surface, searching for any sign, any clue that might explain its arrival. The carvings were intricate, almost too detailed to be the work of a simple craftsman. It was as though the box was designed to hold something far darker than anyone could ever imagine. And then a noise, a faint scraping sound, coming from the direction of the box. It was so quiet, so subtle, that at first, Catherine thought it was just the house settling, the creak of old wood in the walls. But then it came again, a sound that sent a shiver up her spine. She looked at the box, her breath catching in her throat. The carving on the side of the box seemed to shift, as if something inside was moving. Mom, I'm scared, Emily whispered, clutching her mother's arm. I know, Catherine murmured, her heart pounding. We'll be okay. But deep down, she didn't believe it. Something was coming, something dark, and whatever it was, it had found its way into their home. Catherine's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the box. The air around her seemed to thicken, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. She could hear the faint scraping noise again, louder this time, as though something inside was trying to get out. Mom! Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. She clung to her mother's sleeve, her small fingers cold and trembling. Catherine could feel the weight of her daughter's fear pressing against her own anxiety. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. For a moment, Catherine stood there frozen. The silence in the room felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. The scraping noise came again, sharper now, as though something inside the box was pushing against the wood from within. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly, cautiously, lifted the lid. At first, all she could see was darkness, darkness that seemed to swallow everything. The box was hollow, but its interior was lined with what appeared to be faded velvet. Catherine felt a strange pull, as though something inside was beckoning her. Her breath hitched, but her curiosity, darker than she cared to admit, pushed her hand forward. And then she saw it. At the very bottom of the box, partially concealed under layers of dust and decay, was an object. It gleamed faintly, the dim light from the kitchen reflecting off its surface. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she carefully reached for it. It was a necklace, an antique, delicate thing, with a pendant shaped like an eye. The eye itself was made of polished silver, set in the center of a circular frame. The pendant seemed to shimmer with an eerie glow, as though it held some kind of secret within its depths. Catherine couldn't help but stare at it. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her sight, intensified as she held the necklace. Her pulse raced, and for a brief moment she felt the world tilt, as though the room was spinning. "Mom, is that it?" Emily asked, her voice filled with both fascination and fear. "I don't know," Catherine whispered, her voice hoarse. "But we have to be careful." Her fingers brushed the necklace, and a sharp jolt of energy shot through her hand. It was as though the pendant had come to life, its power thrumming beneath her skin. She recoiled, dropping the necklace back into the box, her heart pounding. What just happened?" she whispered, her breath shallow. "I felt it too," Emily said, her voice trembling. "What is it, Mom? What's inside the box?" "I don't know," Catherine said, her words coming out in a strained whisper. "But I think it's not just a necklace." She stared at the box, and suddenly, the air in the room seemed to shift. It felt colder now, as though a dark presence had entered the room. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as if they were alive. Catherine looked around, panic rising in her chest. There was no logical explanation for the way she felt, but she knew deep in her gut that something was wrong. "Mom, I want to go upstairs," Emily said, her voice small and frightened. "Please, I don't like it here." Catherine opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't want to be here either, but something told her that leaving the box alone would be just as dangerous. She had to figure this out. She had to understand what they were dealing with before it was too late. "I'll go get some water," Catherine said, trying to sound calm. "Stay here, Emily." Emily nodded reluctantly, but Catherine could see the fear in her eyes. She moved slowly, hesitating as she made her way toward the kitchen sink. But her steps faltered as she passed by the window. Outside, standing at the edge of the driveway, was someone. A man. Catherine froze, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't know who he was, but there was something haunting about the way he stood there, as though he were waiting for something or someone. His eyes were fixed on the house, staring through the window, though Catherine was certain he couldn't see her. The strange, unsettling feeling that had settled over her deepened. It felt like he was watching them, his gaze piercing and knowing. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him? The one who sent the package? She stood there for a long moment, watching the man, unsure of what to do. She wanted to go outside, to confront him, to demand answers. But something told her that doing so would only make things worse. The man stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, his dark coat flapping slightly in the breeze. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he began to turn. Slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving hers. Catherine's pulse raced, and she backed away from the window, her breath coming in short, quick bursts. She turned to Emily, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what's happening?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Catherine whispered, "but I think we need to leave." We need to go now. She grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock. It came from the front door. Catherine froze. Someone was knocking. Her mind raced. The man outside, the one who had been staring at her, he must have moved around to the front of the house. But why? Why was he knocking now? The sense of dread that had been building inside her intensified, a suffocating force that threatened to crush her. "Stay here," Catherine said, her voice low and urgent. "Don't move. I'll check it out." She could feel the weight of Emily's eyes on her as she made her way toward the door. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. She knew she had to open the door, but something inside her told her that once she did, everything would change. Taking a deep breath, Catherine slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the empty porch outside. No man, no one, just the open air. But there, lying on the ground at her feet, was another package. A second one. Catherine bent down, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. This package, too, was wrapped in plain brown paper, though it seemed even older than the first one. The paper was brittle, yellowing at the edges. But there was something familiar about it, something she couldn't quite place. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the man. But he was gone. The world outside was as still as it had been when she first opened the door. No footsteps. No sign of anyone moving around. The street was empty. Her mind raced as she stared at the package in her hands. What did it mean? Why was it here? And more importantly, who was leaving these packages on her doorstep? "I'm not opening this one," Catherine muttered to herself, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to all of her questions lay within. Catherine stood in the doorway, the second package held tightly in her hands. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and every instinct told her to turn away, to retreat inside and lock the door. But something deeper, something darker, urged her forward. The air around her seemed to thicken, a heavy pressure pressing in from all sides. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Catherine's fingers tightened around the package, and she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency rising within her. She glanced inside the house. Emily was still there, sitting at the table watching her, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Catherine could feel her daughter's gaze, the weight of it pulling her back toward the safety of the house. But the package in her hands felt like an anchor, pulling her into something much darker than anything she had ever known. The thought crossed her mind again. What if she didn't open it? What if she left it on the doorstep and walked away? The house was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of safety. But now, every corner, every room, felt tainted by the sinister presence of the two packages. "Mom!" Emily's voice called from inside, fragile and unsure. Catherine took a deep breath and stepped back into the house, shutting the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place was unnervingly loud in the silence. She walked toward the kitchen, where Emily was still sitting. Her daughter looked up at her, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She had seen the first package, the strange object inside it, and now there was this second one. "What are we going to do, Mom?" Emily asked softly, her voice small, as though the very question itself might summon something terrible. "I don't know," Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be careful. We don't know who's doing this or why." Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. "But Mom, why would someone leave us two packages? And why are they both so weird?" Catherine swallowed, feeling her stomach twist. The same question had been gnawing at her since she first laid eyes on the packages. The unease, the feeling that something was terribly wrong, was growing stronger with every passing second. There was no logical explanation. Nothing made sense. She glanced down at the second package in her hands, and the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than before. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was as if eyes were boring into the back of her head. Her fingers twitched, and her pulse quickened. There was something in the air, something she couldn't explain. "Stay here," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "I need to think for a minute." Without waiting for Emily to respond, Catherine turned away and walked toward the living room. She needed space. She needed to figure out what to do next. The house felt like a cage, its walls pressing in around her, the air thick with something unseen. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, their shapes growing darker, more oppressive. It was as though the very house was alive, watching, listening, waiting for her to make a mistake. Catherine's thoughts raced, but every possible explanation felt just out of reach, slipping through her fingers like sand. She thought about the first package, the strange wooden box with the eye pendant inside, the warning note, the feeling of energy pulsing from the necklace, and then the knock at the door. The second package, now sitting in her hands. There was something ancient about all of this, something that went beyond simple mystery. The necklace in the first package, the eerie carvings, the strange sensation that had filled the room. It all felt connected, tied to something far older, far darker than she could understand. Her gaze drifted toward the mantelpiece, where a small photograph of her family sat in a frame. A snapshot taken just a few months ago. Her husband, Richard, had been smiling next to her, and Emily had been holding a teddy bear, her usual cheerful self. The photograph seemed so distant now, so normal. Too normal for everything that had unfolded. Catherine picked up the photograph and stared at it. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, they had been living their usual life, unaware of the darkness that was now closing in. The world had changed in an instant. A sound broke her thoughts, a low thud. It came from upstairs. Catherine's heart leapt in her chest. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room. The noise had been faint, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make her jump. A soft, muffled sound, like footsteps, had echoed from the second floor. "Emily?" she called, her voice shaky. There was no response. Her pulse quickened. Catherine's mind spun in confusion. It couldn't be Emily. Emily was downstairs, in the kitchen, right where she had left her. Then another sound, a creak of floorboards, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the floor. "Emily!" Catherine called again, louder this time, her voice now edged with panic. Still no answer. Fear surged in her chest, flooding her veins with ice-cold dread. She glanced once more at the photograph in her hand. The peaceful, happy memory of a time before all of this seemed like a cruel joke now. She dropped the photo on the table and rushed to the stairs. Her feet felt heavy, like she was walking through quicksand. Each step upward felt like it was taking an eternity. The silence in the house was unbearable, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for her to find whatever was up there. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, her hands were clammy. She peered down the hallway, her eyes darting from door to door, the shadows stretching across the floor like fingers. The house was deathly still, but the dragging sound continued, slower now, like a slow, deliberate movement. Catherine reached the first bedroom door. The sound was louder here. She pushed the door open with a creak, and nothing. The room was empty, save for the shadows creeping along the walls. No one was there, but the sound, it came again, clearer now, as if something was moving behind the walls. Her heart skipped a beat. The dragging noise. It was unmistakable. It wasn't upstairs. It was inside the walls. A chill ran down Catherine's spine. "Emily?" she whispered again, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. She turned to leave the room, but as she stepped back into the hallway, something caught her eye. There, at the far end of the corridor, the door to the attic was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered behind the crack in the door, as though something, was moving around inside. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The attic door had never been opened since they moved in. She could count on one hand the number of times she'd even noticed it. Faintly visible in the shadows at the end of the hallway, forgotten and out of place. But now it was slightly ajar, the light flickering behind it as though someone or something was inside. Her heart raced in her chest, pounding with a primal fear she couldn't shake. Every instinct told her to run, to turn and flee downstairs to Emily, to lock the doors and never return. But she couldn't ignore the pull, the eerie magnetism that seemed to beckon her closer. She took a tentative step forward, her feet heavy, her movements slow. The air around her felt thick with something malevolent, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The flickering light grew brighter as she approached, casting strange shadows across the walls. It was almost as though the light was alive, pulsing in rhythm with her quickened heartbeat. Catherine reached the attic door and stopped. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling, not sure whether she was even capable of turning it. The door felt like a barrier, a threshold between her and whatever lay beyond. What was it that had called her here? What was in the attic? The sound of dragging had stopped, replaced by the eerie stillness that surrounded her. Taking a deep breath, Catherine turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic beyond was dim, the only light coming from a single bulb that hung in the center of the room. Its flickering glow cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like fingers reaching toward her. She stepped inside, her footfalls soft on the old wooden floorboards, each step echoing too loudly in the quiet. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, Catherine could make out the clutter of old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, and forgotten relics of the past. There were piles of dusty books, crates covered in cobwebs, and faded curtains that fluttered faintly in the draft. But it wasn't the dusty old furniture that caught her attention. It was the presence. A figure stood in the far corner of the attic, facing away from her. At first, she thought it was just another forgotten object, a coat rack, maybe, or some piece of old furniture. But as she looked closer, she realized the figure was moving, shifting slightly as though it were alive. Its form was indistinct, cloaked in shadow, its features blurred by the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello!" Catherine's voice trembled as she spoke, the word coming out too weak, too unsure. The figure didn't move. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the shape in the corner. It was as though it was waiting for her, watching her every move, even though she couldn't make out its face. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, the light above her flickered again, going out entirely. Catherine froze, panic flooding her veins. The room plunged into darkness, and she could feel the oppressive silence pressing in around her. The weight of the air seemed to increase with each passing second, like a physical force. Her pulse was loud in her ears, each beat a reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. And then, from the darkness, came a whisper. "Don't look at it." The voice was low, raspy, almost inaudible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't look at it," the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. Catherine's heart raced. She spun around, but the darkness swallowed her vision. The attic was completely silent again, except for her breathing and the distant sound of her pulse ringing in her ears. The whispering continued. "Don't look at it." The words felt like a command, a warning, and yet Catherine couldn't bring herself to turn away. The pull, the compulsion to look, was too strong. It was as if something in the very air around her was urging her to do it, to find out what was hidden in the corner of the room. Despite the warning, despite the fear that constricted her chest, Catherine slowly turned her gaze back toward the corner. The figure was closer now, closer than it had been moments ago. She hadn't heard it move, but there it was, inches away from her, a shape in the dark that had been watching her from the moment she entered. The shape began to shift. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, twisting and distorting like something alive. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence, a dark, twisted force that stretched and twisted unnaturally. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as the shape slowly morphed into something horrific. A face, or at least the twisted remains of a face, began to emerge from the darkness. Its eyes were hollow, pits of blackness, and its mouth opened wide in a silent scream that seemed to echo in her mind, though no sound came out. It was as though the very fabric of reality around her was bending, warping under the weight of this thing. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't respond. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her eyes locked on the horrific vision before her. The darkness seemed to reach for her, tendrils of shadow curling around her legs, tugging at her like invisible hands. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was still again, and Catherine found herself standing alone in the center of the attic, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Her mind felt like it was on fire, her thoughts scrambled and incoherent. She didn't know how much time passed, but after what felt like an eternity, she forced herself to move. With great effort, she turned toward the door and stumbled out of the attic, her legs weak beneath her. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and she pressed her back against it, trying to steady herself. But the whisper still lingered in her ears, faint but insistent. "Don't look at it." She slid down the door to the floor, her hands gripping the edges of her shirt, trying to steady her breathing. The fear, the darkness, the evil that had been waiting in the attic, it wasn't just in the house. It was in her now. A part of her, something deep inside, was broken, and she couldn't escape it. She needed answers. She needed to know what this thing was and why it had come for them. But most of all, she needed to protect Emily. With trembling hands, Catherine reached for her phone. She had to call someone, anyone. But as her fingers touched the screen, she froze. A text had appeared on the screen, the words cold and ominous. "It's already too late." Catherine's heart skipped a beat as her eyes flicked to the screen. The message was brief, but it cut through her like a knife. She blinked several times, hoping it was a mistake, some sort of glitch, but the words remained, stark and unmistakable. "It's already too late." Her hands shook as she stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. She had no idea who could have sent it, but the message felt like a confirmation of everything she feared. The entity in the attic, the strange occurrences, it was all connected, and it was happening. Whatever it was, it had already claimed them. A cold chill ran down her spine as she looked up, her gaze sweeping the hallway. The house felt different. Heavier. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows darker, more oppressive. She could almost feel the air itself growing thicker, pressing in from all sides, making it hard to breathe. Every sense was heightened, every noise magnified, as if the house were alive and aware of her every movement. She needed to find Emily. She needed to protect her. Still trembling, Catherine stood up and stumbled toward the stairs. She called out her daughter's name, but her voice was hollow, swallowed by the overwhelming silence that hung in the air. The house felt like a tomb, and the thought of Emily alone downstairs made Catherine's stomach churn. Her heart raced as she descended the stairs. The house was eerily still, too still. The usual creaks and groans of an old house were absent, replaced by an unsettling quiet. It was as though the house itself had stopped breathing. When Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The kitchen was empty. The table was still set, the cereal bowls from breakfast left untouched, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. "Emily?" Catherine's voice cracked as she called out again, her fear rising. No answer. Catherine's chest tightened. She stepped into the living room, her eyes scanning every corner. Still no sign of her daughter. Panic began to set in as her mind raced with the possibilities. Where could she be? A cold draft brushed against her skin as she turned toward the hallway leading to the back door. The wind had picked up outside, howling against the windows, but something else caught her attention, the back door, which was slightly ajar. Catherine's heart pounded harder. She hadn't opened that door. No one had. She rushed to it, her hand shaking as she pushed it open the rest of the way. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning like the house itself. The garden, which had once been neat and orderly, now appeared wild and unkempt, the overgrown bushes and creeping vines casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Emily?" Catherine's voice trembled as she stepped out into the yard. There was no response. The wind howled again, but it was too quiet, too still. The air seemed suffocating, thick with an oppressive energy that made every breath feel labored. Catherine took a few tentative steps forward, scanning the yard for any sign of her daughter. Her eyes darted between the trees, the garden shed, and the distant edge of the property. It was impossible to shake the feeling that someone, was watching her, lurking in the shadows just beyond her sight. Then she saw it, a figure, small and hunched, standing by the edge of the garden. The figure was still, its back to her, just barely visible in the dim light. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. It was Emily. "Emily?" she called again, her voice hoarse. The figure didn't move. Catherine's stomach twisted. She took a few more steps forward, her legs feeling heavy, like she was wading through thick mud. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around her, closing in on her with every step. As she got closer, she noticed that something was off. Emily's posture was wrong. She wasn't standing normally. Her shoulders were hunched, her head tilted forward at an unnatural angle. It was like she wasn't quite herself. A sickening, gut-wrenching feeling crept up Catherine's spine. "Emily, please," Catherine pleaded, her voice shaking as she reached out. But before she could take another step, the figure jerked suddenly, its head snapping up to look at her. Catherine froze. The face staring back at her wasn't Emily's. It was twisted, contorted in a grotesque parody of a human face. The eyes were wide, too wide, the pupils dilated and black as coal, while the mouth hung open in a silent scream, frozen in a grotesque grin. The skin was pale, stretched too thin over the bones, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with a faint, unsettling glow. Catherine stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the air grow colder, the shadows closing in around her like a suffocating blanket. Her breathing quickened as the figure began to move toward her, its limbs jerking in unnatural, disjointed motions. "Mom," the thing rasped, its voice a hollow, distorted imitation of Emily's. It took a step closer, its eyes locked on Catherine with an intensity that sent a wave of terror crashing through her. Catherine's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt frozen, unwilling to obey. The creature, the thing that had once been her daughter, continued to advance, its movements becoming more erratic and twisted. It was as though it was being pulled by some unseen force, dragged forward against its will. She couldn't take it anymore. With every ounce of strength left in her, Catherine turned and bolted back toward the house. She didn't look back. She didn't dare to. Her heart raced as she crossed the threshold, slamming the door behind her and locking it with shaking hands. For a moment, there was silence. Then the knocking began. It started softly, a faint tap-tap-tap against the door. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it became a frantic, relentless pounding. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror. The sound was coming from outside. The thing, whatever it was at the door, trying to get in. "Mom," came the voice again, muffled through the door, a distorted echo of Emily's voice. "Let me in." Catherine's mind raced, her thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl. The house felt like a trap, the walls closing in, and there was no escape. She could hear it moving outside, the slow scrape of something dragging along the ground. The pounding stopped. The silence was deafening, and then a whisper. "Don't look at it." The message, once again, slithered into her mind, a command she couldn't ignore. She could feel it in her bones. Whatever was out there, whatever was happening, it was more than she could understand. And it was already too late. Catherine's pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Her eyes flicked nervously to the door, her mind reeling from the events of the night. The whisper had come again, but this time, it wasn't just a warning, it was a command. An unavoidable, undeniable truth that gripped her with an icy hand. She forced herself to move, every step heavy, her body protesting as if it knew the danger was far from over. She didn't want to look back. She couldn't. The fear of seeing that face again, that grotesque imitation of Emily, was unbearable. But there was something else, something deeper. The overwhelming sense that it was still here, still watching, still waiting. The pounding on the door stopped, but it was replaced by an eerie silence. Not a quiet silence, though. It was the kind of silence that carried a presence with it, like the calm before a storm. Her breath hitched in her chest as she slowly backed away from the door, her mind struggling to make sense of everything. The strange happenings, the figure in the attic, the distorted creature in the yard. It was all connected. But what did it mean? And how could she protect Emily if she didn't understand it? "Mom!" The voice again, but this time it was softer, more pleading, a desperate whisper that chilled her to the bone. Catherine's heart leapt in her chest. She turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with terror. The hallway was still, empty, but she could feel it. The presence, the weight of it pressing in on her from all sides. The voice came again, this time from the stairs. "Mom, please." Catherine's blood ran cold. It was Emily's voice, unmistakable. The same voice she'd heard 1,000 times. But there was something wrong with it. It was laced with desperation, as though it had been twisted and distorted, stretched beyond recognition. Without thinking, Catherine rushed to the stairs, her legs weak beneath her. She couldn't leave her daughter out there. She couldn't abandon her. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was Emily. But it wasn't Emily. The thing that stood there, silhouetted in the dim light from the hallway, was wrong. Its body was bent at an unnatural angle, its limbs elongated and twisted, like it had been pulled and stretched beyond its limits. The face, it was the face of her daughter, yes, but it was contorted, the features blurred and distorted, as though they were being warped by something unseen. The eyes, black as coal, locked onto hers, and that twisted smile crept across the face, stretching far too wide to be natural. Catherine's breath hitched in her throat. "Emily?" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. She wanted to move, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs were like lead, rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the sheer terror that held her captive. The thing took a step forward. "No, don't," Catherine whispered, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. The thing stopped. It tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, and for a moment, Catherine thought it might speak. But it didn't. Instead, the thing's eyes, those black, soulless pits, focused on her, and for the first time she saw it. The hunger, the darkness that lurked within. The air around her thickened. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and distorting, as if the very space around her were being twisted by the presence that had overtaken her daughter. The atmosphere was suffocating, like something ancient and malevolent was awakening. "Emily," Catherine whispered again, this time her voice breaking. "Please, please come back." But the thing just stared at her, unblinking, as if it had no intention of responding. It was like it was listening, waiting for something. But what? Suddenly it moved. It rushed toward her with terrifying speed, its limbs jerking and twisting in unnatural ways, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Catherine stumbled backward, her heart in her throat, as the thing lunged toward her, its hands reaching out to grab her. And then the lights flickered. Everything went black. For a split second, Catherine felt like she was falling, like the very fabric of reality had unraveled. The darkness was complete, absolute, and the only sound she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears. But just as quickly as the darkness had swallowed her, the lights came back on. Catherine gasped in a breath, her eyes snapping open, wide with fear. She was no longer in the hallway. The house had changed. The walls were no longer familiar. The floor beneath her feet felt different, warped, like she was standing on a different plane of existence. The once cozy warmth of the home had been replaced by a chilling coldness, an oppressive, unnatural atmosphere that made her skin crawl. The hallway stretched out before her, far longer than it should have been, the walls lined with shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. The door at the end of the hallway was wide open, a faint light glowing from within. The air was thick, like it was saturated with something dark, something malevolent. Catherine turned around, her eyes scanning the new reality she found herself in. The room she had been in was gone, replaced by a vast, empty space. It was as though the house she had known had been consumed by something else, something far older, far more dangerous. And then she heard the whisper again. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost a coaxing, but there was no mistaking it. It was the thing, the presence that had taken Emily. It was beckoning her forward. Catherine didn't want to go. She didn't want to face it. But something inside her, some primal instinct, told her she had no choice. She had to move forward, had to confront whatever this thing was before it consumed everything she loved. She took a hesitant step forward, her legs shaking beneath her, the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. Each step she took felt like she was walking into the depths of some dark abyss, the shadows closing in on her with every move. And then, just as she reached the door at the end of the hallway, she heard a familiar voice. "Mom!" Catherine froze. It was Emily. Her voice, clear and unmistakable, cut through the darkness like a beacon of light. But it didn't sound distorted this time. It was her daughter's voice, filled with hope and longing. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, torn between the darkness that called her forward and the voice of her daughter, the voice that had once been her greatest source of love and comfort. "Emily?" she called out, her voice trembling with desperation. The voice came again. "Mom, come find me." Catherine's pulse quickened at the sound of Emily's voice, so familiar, so comforting. It was like a lifeline in the sea of darkness. She didn't hesitate this time. She rushed toward the door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel the beat in her throat. Every instinct told her to go, to find her daughter, to make sure she was safe. She swung the door open. The room on the other side was not what she expected. Instead of the comforting familiarity of her home, the room was cold, barren. The walls were cracked, peeling with age, and the floor was covered in dust and old, brittle cobwebs. A low, flickering light hung overhead, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe on their own, like dark tendrils seeking to ensnare her. There was no sign of Emily. "Emily?" Catherine called, her voice trembling with fear, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty, save for a single old-fashioned rocking chair in the center, creaking gently as though moved by an invisible force. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, heavy and suffocating. The door slammed shut behind her. Catherine whipped around, panic flooding her veins as she tried to open it again, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked, as though the house itself had trapped her inside. She turned back to face the room. The shadows seemed to dance along the walls, twisting and flickering like they had a life of their own. And then a sound, soft, faint, like a whisper. "Mom!" The voice came from the far corner of the room. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, her heart gripped by terror. The voice was unmistakable, Emily's voice. But there was something wrong. It wasn't her daughter standing in the corner, that much was clear. "Emily?" Catherine whispered, her voice strained, desperate. She took a step forward, her body trembling. The shadows shifted, and something emerged from the corner. A figure, tall and thin, moving with an eerie fluidity. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its head was too large, its face obscured by darkness. The air seemed to ripple around it, distorting the light in a sickening way, as though reality itself were bending under its presence. It took a step toward her. "Mom, please." The voice. It was so close now, so familiar. But it was distorted, twisted. The words were a sickly echo of her daughter's, hollow and broken. Catherine took a step back, her legs shaking, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. The hunger in its presence was palpable, suffocating, like it was drawing all warmth and light from the room. "Stay away!" Catherine shouted, her voice louder now, filled with terror. She stumbled backward, but the thing followed, moving with unnatural grace, its head tilting slightly as though observing her, studying her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't her daughter. This couldn't be Emily. But then what was it? What was happening to them? What was that thing? "Emily," she called again, her voice pleading now. "Please, I need you. I'm here. Please answer me." The creature's head jerked toward her, its black eyes deep, endless voids, locking onto hers. For a moment, everything was still. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and then the creature spoke. "I'm here." It wasn't Emily's voice anymore. It was something else entirely. A low, guttural rasp that reverberated through Catherine's chest, making her stomach churn. The thing's mouth twisted into something that resembled a smile, though it was grotesque, warped beyond recognition. It was an expression that conveyed malice, hunger, and something much older, much darker. Catherine stumbled backward again, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Her mind screamed at her to run, but the door was locked. There was no escape, no place to hide. "Please," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I don't understand. What do you want? Where is Emily?" The thing took another step forward, and Catherine's body froze. It was too close now. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel its coldness creeping into her skin, seeping through her clothes. It was like she was standing in the presence of something not quite human, not quite alive, but something far worse. "I want," the creature rasped, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "What is mine?" Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She didn't understand. What did it mean? What was this thing? And why was it here? Why had it come for them? Before she could process it further, the creature reached out toward her, its long, thin fingers outstretched, and in a split second, it was right in front of her. Its touch was cold, freezing, worse than ice. It felt like death itself. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to fight back, but her body wouldn't respond. Her limbs were paralyzed, as if the thing's very presence had stolen her will to move. She felt her strength draining, like her life force was being sucked away with every passing second. "Please stop!" Catherine cried out, her voice desperate. I'm not yours. I'm not." The creature's hand closed around her wrist, its grip like iron, sending a shock of icy cold up her arm. She gasped, her vision blurring as the darkness around her thickened, pressing in from all sides. The world seemed to shift and warp, as if she were slipping into some other reality, one where she no longer belonged. The shadows swallowed her whole, and then just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The thing let go of her wrist. Catherine's breath came in ragged gasps as she staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating, oppressive. She blinked, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but when her eyes focused, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The room was changing. The walls were no longer cracked. The floor was no longer covered in dust. The shadows that had once loomed so large had retreated, fading into the corners of the room. But it was not the room she had entered moments ago. It was her home. It was the living room, the place she had been just minutes earlier. But something was wrong. Everything was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, the curtains torn, and the windows shattered. The house was destroyed, ruined, like it had been through some horrific event. But the worst part? Emily was standing at the far end of the room, and she wasn't herself. Catherine's blood ran cold as she looked at her daughter. No, the thing that was pretending to be Emily. The girl standing in the corner had the same face, the same hair, the same eyes. But there was no warmth in those eyes. No trace of the loving, innocent child Catherine had known for so many years. The figure before her was something else entirely. Its posture was wrong, stiff and unnatural. Its movements were jerky, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. It stood motionless in the corner, staring at Catherine with a gaze that made her skin crawl. "Emily?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The thing didn't respond. It didn't even blink. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly took a step forward. She had to know what had happened to her daughter, to understand why this thing had taken her place. Was Emily trapped somewhere? Was she still alive? But as Catherine took another step, the thing's head jerked toward her with unnatural speed, its eyes widening, pupils dilating as if it had seen something it wasn't supposed to see. The smile that spread across its face was grotesque, twisted, mocking. It was a smile that had no place on a child's face, a smile that belonged to something ancient, something evil. The thing's lips parted, and its voice came out, hollow and distorted. "Mom, you shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in Catherine's mind like a sickening chant. It sounded like Emily, her daughter, but it was wrong, so wrong. The voice was layered with something dark, something older. It wasn't just a child's voice anymore. It was something far more sinister. Catherine's breath hitched in her throat, her chest tight with panic. The thing in front of her was no longer her daughter. It couldn't be. But if this was not Emily, then what was it? And what had happened to her little girl? "Where is Emily?" Catherine demanded, her voice rising, filled with a mix of desperation and fear. She had to get answers. She had to find her daughter before it was too late. The thing took a step forward, its movements still unnaturally stiff, its body jerking with each motion. It didn't speak this time, but it raised one hand, a pale, trembling hand, and pointed toward the center of the room. At the spot where the furniture had been thrown aside, where the floor was cracked and warped. Catherine's breath caught as her gaze followed the pointed finger, and then she saw it. There, in the center of the room, was a small, intricately carved box. It was old, ancient in fact. The wood was darkened with age, the carvings on its surface worn from time, but still discernible. The box seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if it were alive, its very presence unsettling, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Catherine's heart raced as she took a hesitant step toward the box. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the weight of dread pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel the darkness that surrounded the box, could feel its malevolent power. The thing that had once been her daughter watched her closely, its expression unchanged, its eyes fixed on Catherine with an unnerving intensity. It said nothing, but Catherine could feel the weight of its gaze, the sense that it was waiting for something, watching her every move. With a trembling hand, Catherine reached out for the box. As soon as her fingers brushed against the surface, a jolt of cold shot through her arm. It felt like a shock, a surge of energy that rippled through her body, making her gasp in pain. She recoiled instinctively, but the box seemed to call to her, drawing her in, urging her to open it. She had to open it. She needed to know what was inside. She needed to know what had happened to Emily. With a trembling breath, Catherine lifted the box, feeling its weight in her hands. The wood creaked under her touch, as if the box were alive, as if it were aware of what was about to happen. She could feel something pulling at her, a force beyond her control urging her to open it. And then, with a quiet click, the lid of the box popped open. Inside, resting in the center of a bed of velvet, was a small, tarnished pendant. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she lifted the pendant out of the box. It was simple, delicate, a silver chain with a pendant shaped like a crescent moon. But as her fingers brushed over it, she felt something, a vibration, a pulse of energy, as if the pendant were alive. And then a voice, not the thing that had once been Emily, not the whispers from the darkness, a new voice, a voice that felt ancient, like it had been speaking for centuries. "You found it," the voice said, low and guttural, reverberating through Catherine's very bones. The key to everything. The pendant grew warm in Catherine's hand, and she could feel the power of it, seeping into her skin, into her soul. It was more than just an object. It was a connection, a link to something beyond this world, something dark and powerful, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to find it. Catherine's head spun. She could hear the whispers now, in her mind, in the walls, in the very air around her. The whispers of 1,000 lost souls, of those who had come before her. And in the center of it all, the presence, the thing that had taken her daughter, that had twisted Emily into this horrible imitation. It was all connected. The box, the pendant, the house, the thing that had stolen her daughter away. And now it was all turning toward her. "You should have left it alone," the voice said again, its tone colder this time, mocking. "Now you will pay the price." Catherine's heart raced as she looked down at the pendant, her fingers tightening around it. She could feel its pull, its gravity, as if it were calling her toward something. Something she didn't understand. Something that could destroy everything. The room began to spin, the shadows closing in tighter, thicker, as though they were reaching out to consume her. Her breathing became shallow, ragged, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She had to get out. She had to escape. But she wasn't sure if she could. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last as the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls closed in, the shadows thickening, moving like they were alive. The whispers in her mind were deafening now, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices, each one speaking at once, their words a jumble of anger, pain, and desperation. Her fingers trembled around the pendant, the warmth of it now scorching her skin. The energy emanating from the silver crescent was palpable, filling the air with an oppressive weight that threatened to crush her under its power. "Leave it," Catherine whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the overwhelming noise in her head. "Just let it go." But the pendant wouldn't let go. The more she tried to pull away, the tighter it seemed to grip her, as if it were bound to her soul, tied to her very essence. She felt herself sinking into the darkness, losing control, the pull of the pendant stronger than anything she had ever experienced. She could hear Emily's voice again, faint but clear through the fog of whispers. "Mom, help me." It was weak, fragile, as if coming from a great distance. Catherine's heart clenched at the sound of it, a spark of hope flaring briefly within her. Could it be real? Could Emily still be out there? But the moment of hope was fleeting. The shadows stirred once more, and the thing that had once been her daughter, the creature that had replaced her, took a step forward. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger. "No," Catherine gasped, stumbling back. She could feel the weight of its gaze on her, like a heavy hand pressing down on her chest. "You're not her. You're not my daughter." The creature didn't respond. It simply moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. The shadows seemed to coil around it, feeding off its presence, as if the darkness itself recognized the evil that stood before her. The walls groaned, the house shuddering as if the very structure were alive, as if it, too, were reacting to the presence of this thing. Catherine could feel the vibrations, the way the air itself seemed to hum with power. Her mind raced. She had to find a way to stop it. She had to save Emily. But the pendant, she knew deep down that it held the answers. It held the key. But to what? The thing, the creature, moved closer still, its long, thin arms outstretched, its fingers curling in a gesture of possession. Catherine's breath quickened as it neared. There was no way out. No way to fight it. She had no choice but to face whatever this thing was. "Please," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "Please tell me what you want. Why are you doing this? Why are you here?" The creature's smile widened, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. It tilted its head, as if considering her words. "You opened the box," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. "Now you must pay the price." Before Catherine could react, the thing lunged at her, its long fingers closing around her arm with a grip so cold. It felt like it was draining the warmth from her very bones. She gasped, the shock of its touch sending a jolt of panic through her. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, the pendant still clutched tightly in her hand. "No," she cried out, but the words barely left her mouth before they were swallowed by the creature's terrifying presence. The world around her seemed to blur, the room spinning once more. She felt herself being pulled deeper into the shadows, her body weightless, as if she were floating through an endless void. Her thoughts were fractured, her mind consumed by the darkness, by the overwhelming power that now had hold of her. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness receded. Catherine blinked, disoriented. The creature was gone, and the oppressive weight of the house had lifted. The shadows had retreated to their corners, leaving the room eerily quiet. She was alone, but she wasn't. The voice, the whisper that had first drawn her here, came again, faint but clear. "Mom!" It was Emily's voice. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. She had to find her. She had to save her daughter. "Emily?" Catherine called out, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that if she spoke too loudly, the illusion would vanish. "Where are you? Please answer me." The air around her grew heavy again, and the shadows began to twist once more. But this time they weren't hostile. They were beckoning, pulling her toward something, toward Emily. Without thinking, Catherine followed the shadows, her legs moving on their own, her body instinctively drawn to whatever lay ahead. She felt herself moving through the house, through corridors she had never seen before. The walls seemed to shift, stretching and contracting as if the house itself were alive, guiding her. The whispers grew louder as she walked, their voices blending together in a maddening chorus. But through it all, Emily's voice remained distinct. Clear, faint but unmistakable. "Mom, please." Catherine pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs aching from the strain. She had to get to Emily. She had to save her. The further she went, the darker the house became. The shadows deepened, pooling in the corners, reaching out to touch her with cold fingers. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the house was trying to swallow her whole. But Catherine couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Finally, she reached a door, one she didn't recognize. It was old, wooden, and covered in strange symbols. The moment her hand touched the handle, a wave of cold washed over her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging her to open it. With a deep breath, Catherine turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, except for Emily. Catherine's heart soared as she saw her daughter standing in the center of the room, her back to her head bent low, as if in deep thought. "Emily?" Catherine whispered, stepping forward. The girl slowly turned around. Catherine's heart stopped. It wasn't Emily. It was the thing that had replaced her. The creature, the twisted mockery of her daughter. "Mom," the thing rasped, its mouth twisting into that grotesque smile. "You're too late." Catherine staggered back, her heart slamming against her ribs as the creature, the twisted reflection of her daughter, took a step forward. It smiled again, but this time the smile was deeper, more sinister, filled with a malice that made her skin crawl. Its eyes, once full of innocence, were now black voids, swirling with an ancient darkness. "No," Catherine whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're not her. You're not Emily." The thing tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words, its smile widening even further. "Of course I am," it crooned, its voice high and mocking. "I'm everything you wanted, Mom. I'm your perfect little girl." Catherine's stomach twisted as she took a cautious step back, her eyes scanning the room for any way out. There was nowhere to run. The walls seemed to press in on her, closing her off from any escape. The air felt thick with dread, each breath a struggle, as if the very atmosphere was choking her. The creature's laughter echoed around the room, cold and hollow. "You should have left it alone," it said, its voice dripping with venom. "You should have never opened the box. Now you're mine, just like all the others." Catherine's mind raced. She had to get out. She had to find a way to save Emily, her Emily. But the more she thought about the pendant, about the box, the more she realized that this was no simple haunting. This was something much darker, something far older and more powerful than she could comprehend. "You don't understand," Catherine said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You can't be her. You can't take her from me." The creature's smile faltered for a split second, and in that moment, Catherine seized the opportunity. She reached down to her neck, where the pendant still hung, warm against her skin. She had to stop this, whatever this was. It was tied to the pendant, to the box. But how? What was she supposed to do with it? As if reading her thoughts, the thing's voice filled the room once again, this time low and threatening. "It's already too late. You should have stayed away, but now you're part of it. You're part of us." Catherine's fingers tightened around the pendant, as a terrible realization washed over her. The whispers, they weren't just in her mind. They were coming from the pendant, from the box. The power that had drawn her in, the darkness that had taken Emily, it was all connected. The creature took another step forward, its fingers twitching as if it were eager to reach out and grab her. "You'll never leave this place," it hissed. "None of you ever do." Catherine took a deep breath, summoning all the strength she had left. She had to break free. She had to do something. She couldn't let this thing win. She wouldn't let it claim her daughter, or her. With a surge of desperation, Catherine yanked the pendant from around her neck and held it out in front of her. The warmth had turned cold, the energy pulsing now with an unfamiliar intensity. It felt like the pendant was alive, as if it were responding to her fear, her determination. The room trembled as if the house itself were waking up, as if it were reacting to the pendant's power. The creature flinched, its smile faltering for the first time. "What do you think you're doing?" it demanded, its voice growing more frantic. "You can't stop it. You're already ours." But Catherine didn't listen. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pendant, on the energy it radiated, on the connection that had been formed the moment she touched it. She could feel it, feel the dark force that had bound her, feel it crawling beneath her skin, trying to take control. But she wouldn't let it. She concentrated harder, pushing against the pull of the darkness, forcing herself to remember everything she had loved, everything that had kept her going. Emily, her family, her home. The pendant began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that filled the room, reverberating through the very walls. Catherine's hands shook, but she held on tight, refusing to let go. The creature shrieked, its form flickering, wavering like a mirage. It reached out, its fingers claws now, but Catherine stood firm, her eyes still closed, her mind focused on the pendant, on breaking the connection. "You can't control me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "I won't let you." The pendant pulsed one final time, a wave of energy so intense that it felt like the very air was ripping apart. The house groaned, the shadows recoiling as if burned by the light that now emanated from the pendant. The creature let out a final, blood-curdling scream, and then, just like that, it was gone. Catherine stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. The pendant had gone cold again, its power seemingly spent, its light faded. She opened her eyes and looked around. The room was still. The darkness that had once consumed everything was gone. The walls no longer felt alive, the air no longer thick with malevolence. But Emily wasn't here. Catherine's heart sank as she realized the terrible truth. Whatever had taken her daughter was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. The pendant, the box, the evil that had been unleashed, it wasn't over. Not yet. Her only hope now was to find Emily, to save her from whatever nightmare she had become trapped in, and to stop this thing from taking anyone else. With one last look at the room, the place where it had all begun, Catherine turned and walked toward the door. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop until she found her daughter, until she found Emily. Catherine stepped out of the room, the silence that greeted her a stark contrast to the chaos she had just experienced. Her legs felt unsteady, her body weary, but her mind was sharp with purpose. She couldn't let herself falter now. Emily was still out there, somewhere, and the horrors she had faced were far from over. The house, once alive with darkness, was eerily still. It almost felt abandoned, the air stale and heavy with the remnants of what had occurred. But Catherine could feel it in her bones. The house was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. She moved cautiously down the corridor, her steps tentative but resolute. The walls seemed to close in with each step, the shadows twisting in the corners, reminding her of the malevolent force that still lingered in the house. Her fingers still clutched the pendant, the cold metal a reminder of the terrible power she had unlocked. As Catherine reached the stairs, she froze. A sound, a soft, barely audible whisper, like a breath on the wind. It came from above, from the attic. Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel it. It was her. Emily was up there. Without a second thought, Catherine hurried up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The house seemed to groan in protest, as though it didn't want her to go any further. But she ignored it. There was no turning back now. At the top of the stairs, she found the door to the attic. The faintest light slipped through the cracks around the doorframe, casting an eerie glow on the darkened hallway. She could feel the pull, the tug of the darkness urging her forward. But she couldn't stop. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her skin. She hesitated, only for a moment, before pushing the door open. The attic was a mess. Dust and cobwebs filled the corners. Old furniture lay abandoned in the shadows, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. But it was what lay in the center of the room that made Catherine's blood run cold. Emily was sitting there, or at least it looked like her. The girl's back was to Catherine, her small figure hunched over, her hair spilling down in tangled knots. The pale light from the window illuminated her in an almost ghostly way, making her appear fragile, broken. Catherine could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Emily?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "Emily, it's me. Mom." The girl didn't respond. Catherine took a cautious step forward. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer, each step bringing her closer to the one person she had been fighting for. But as she reached out to touch her daughter, Emily's head snapped around. It wasn't her daughter's face. Not entirely. The eyes were the same, but the expression, the look, was alien, monstrous. A twisted mockery of Emily's innocence. Her lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing human in it. It was a smile full of malice, full of cold, unfeeling hunger. "Mom!" The voice that came from Emily's mouth was not hers. It was distorted, deeper, laced with something unholy. "You came all this way for nothing." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What have you done to her?" she gasped, the tears in her eyes threatening to spill. "Please, I just want my daughter back." The thing that looked like Emily stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stepped closer to Catherine, each step dragging with a sound like nails scraping across stone. "You should have stayed away, Catherine," it whispered, its voice now harsh, rasping. "It was never about her. It was about you, all along." Catherine backed away, her heart racing, her mind struggling to keep up with the confusion and terror that threatened to consume her. This wasn't Emily. This couldn't be Emily. But if this thing was not Emily, then who or what was it? The thing that stood before her seemed to read her thoughts, its twisted smile widening. "You opened the box. You thought you could just walk away. But you're already part of it now. Part of us." Catherine's mind reeled as the room seemed to close in around her. The whispers returned, louder than ever. She could feel the presence of something more ancient, more powerful than she had ever imagined. Something that had been waiting for her. Something that had been waiting for all of them. "Why?" Catherine cried, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" The creature tilted its head, regarding her with an almost pitying look. "You opened the door. You found the key. Now you're part of the game. There's no escaping it." Suddenly, the room began to tremble. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something dark and powerful. The shadows began to move again, creeping along the walls, reaching for Catherine, trying to pull her into the suffocating darkness. The thing that looked like Emily raised its hand, and the shadows obeyed. They twisted and writhed, swirling around her, closing in with terrifying speed. "No!" Catherine screamed, her heart racing. She stumbled backward, but the shadows followed, relentless and unyielding. She clutched the pendant tightly, as though its cold metal could protect her. The whispers grew louder, each voice a cacophony in her ears, pushing her to the brink of madness. "Mom," the creature whispered again, its voice chillingly calm. "You can't fight us. You never could." Catherine's mind was a blur. She had to escape. She had to save her daughter. She had to end this nightmare. In a last-ditch effort, Catherine raised the pendant high above her head, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "Get away from me!" The pendant flared with a burst of light, blindingly bright, a wave of energy that knocked Catherine off her feet. The shadows recoiled, screeching in agony, as though the light had burned them. The creature, Emily's twisted imitation, howled, a sound so terrible that it shook the very foundation of the house. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded. The room was silent. The darkness was gone. The shadows had retreated, and the oppressive weight of the house had lifted. But Emily was still gone. Catherine pushed herself up from the floor, her body shaking, her mind in turmoil. What had she just done? What had happened to the thing that had taken Emily? Was it truly gone, or had it simply retreated, waiting for another chance to strike? And what about her daughter? What had become of her? The room was empty, save for the remnants of the nightmare she had just endured. But deep down, Catherine knew this was far from over. There was more to this house, more to the pendant, more to the darkness that had claimed her daughter. And she wasn't leaving without the answers. Catherine stood in the center of the attic, trembling, her heart hammering in her chest. The silence that surrounded her felt suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, making it difficult to breathe. She felt as if the very air had thickened, the walls closing in once more. Her thoughts spiraled, and she could barely hold on to them. She had seen it, that thing, and yet somehow it had not been enough. Her daughter was still gone. She staggered back to the door, her mind swirling in confusion. The stairs felt like an eternity away, but there was no choice but to move forward. She couldn't stand still, not when Emily was out there, somewhere, trapped in this nightmare. Her footsteps were slow but deliberate as she descended the stairs, the echo of each creak sending a chill down her spine. The house felt colder now, almost as though it were responding to the loss of the creature, no, the thing, that had been in the attic. A part of Catherine wanted to scream, to call out for her daughter, but the air felt heavy with an oppressive energy, the house itself rejecting her pleas. As Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs, her gaze fell upon the front door. It was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of moonlight spilling through the gap. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that, even though the house felt quieter now, there was still something wrong. Something out there. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a breath just out of reach. They seemed to travel through the walls, through the very floor beneath her feet. Her eyes darted around, seeking the source, but the house remained eerily still. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming words in the darkness. "Come back," they hissed. "Come back to us." Catherine's heart pounded as the whispering grew in intensity, the walls now vibrating with the force of it. The voices were not coming from within the house. They were coming from the garden. She froze, her body tense. Her hand gripped the doorknob, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingers, her mind wrestling with what she was hearing. The garden, the neighbor's garden. Her heart skipped a beat as she remembered the strange stories she had heard in town. The old neighbor who had passed away, the strange disappearances that had occurred, the rumors about the garden itself, how no one dared to venture too close. Catherine turned toward the window. The moonlight illuminated the garden just beyond the backyard, casting long shadows over the pristine grass, the carefully tended flowers. And there, in the center of it all, she saw something. A figure. It stood motionless in the center of the garden, bathed in moonlight, its face obscured by a hooded cloak. The silhouette was eerily still, almost as if it were waiting for something, or someone. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape. The figure wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, far too tall to be anything but unnatural. The cloak billowed slightly in the breeze, but there was something wrong about the way it moved. It seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't entirely real. Her hand trembled as she pulled the door open just a fraction, peering out into the night. The garden, bathed in the pale light of the moon, seemed peaceful at first glance, but Catherine knew better now. She knew that nothing here was as it seemed. "Emily," she whispered again, her voice shaky but determined. She wasn't sure what it was about the figure in the garden that called to her, but she couldn't ignore the pull, the sense that it was somehow tied to everything that had happened. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at her skin as she moved cautiously toward the gate that separated the house from the garden. The wind rustled the trees, the leaves whispering secrets she couldn't understand. The figure in the garden didn't move. It just stood there, its presence like a shadow, a symbol of something ancient and terrifying. As Catherine approached the gate, she hesitated. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could feel the tension in the air, like a storm just waiting to break. "Come back to us." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "We've been waiting for you." The voice was unmistakable now. It was Emily's voice. Or, at least, it sounded like her. But it was wrong, warped and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth, from some place where light never reached. "Emily?" Catherine called, her voice rising, trembling with fear and desperation. The figure in the garden moved then. It didn't walk, but rather glided, its feet barely touching the ground. The cloak shimmered in the moonlight, and Catherine could swear it wasn't a cloak at all, but something far darker, something that moved like liquid shadows, undulating and shifting with each passing second. Catherine's pulse raced as she moved forward, unable to stop herself now, as if some unseen force was pushing her toward the figure. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with 1,000 voices, each one calling to her, begging her to come closer. The figure stopped just at the edge of the garden, its hooded head tilting upward, revealing nothing beneath. No face, no features, only an empty void that seemed to suck in the light. "You're here," the voice crooned. "Finally. You belong to us now." Catherine took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The force of whatever was happening to her now was too strong, too overwhelming. The air was thick, the darkness swirling around her, and in that moment, she knew that whatever was standing in front of her, whatever had been waiting in the garden, was not something that could be outrun. It had waited too long for her to arrive. She reached for the pendant at her neck, the cold metal burning against her skin. It was her only connection to Emily now, her only hope to break whatever hold the house had on her. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, each voice more insistent, more demanding, until Catherine could hardly think. "Come back," the figure whispered, its voice rising to a pitch that made her insides twist. "It's time to join us, Catherine." Catherine's breath hitched as she stared into the void beneath the hood, into the place where her daughter's soul had been trapped. And then, without warning, the darkness reached out to her. The darkness reached out to Catherine like a tidal wave, sweeping over her, suffocating her. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as if the very atmosphere was becoming thick with the weight of the shadows. She could feel them closing in, tendrils of blackness curling around her, pulling her toward the figure in the garden. Her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't break free. The whispers surged in her ears, a cacophony of voices blending into one dissonant, maddening hum. She could hear Emily's voice clearly now, desperate and lost, pleading with her to come closer. "Mom," the voice echoed, distorted and hollow. "Please, I need you. You have to save me." Catherine's chest tightened, the weight of her daughter's words pressing down on her like a vice. She tried to take a step back, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Her fingers clutched the pendant desperately, as though the cold metal could anchor her to reality. "No," she screamed into the darkness. "I won't let you take her. I won't let you have her." But the shadows only tightened their grip, pulling her forward, inch by agonizing inch. The figure in the garden remained still, its head tilted downward, watching her with an unseen gaze. It was waiting for her to succumb to its will. Catherine's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. She needed to do something. She had to break free. But the power of the house, of the darkness that surrounded her, was too much. She couldn't fight it on her own. And then she remembered. The pendant. The metal felt cold against her skin, and she realized with a shock that it wasn't just any pendant. It was the key to ending this madness, to undoing whatever curse had bound her and her daughter to this house. Her fingers tightened around the pendant, and she felt a surge of energy pulse through her. A light, a soft, glowing light, began to emanate from the pendant, spilling out in a faint but steady glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The darkness around her recoiled, as if the light itself was poison, driving it away. With newfound strength, Catherine lifted the pendant higher, her voice trembling as she whispered, "This ends now." The light grew brighter, pushing back the shadows, forcing them to retreat. The whispers screeched in agony, the voices twisting and distorting into something inhuman. Catherine felt the pull of the darkness weakening, felt the weight on her chest lift, as the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the house began to loosen. But it wasn't enough. The figure in the garden moved then, its presence undeterred by the light. It began to glide toward her once more, its hooded head tilting upward. The void beneath its hood deepened, a darkness so pure, so absolute, that it seemed to consume everything in its path. "You can't stop this," the figure hissed, its voice now a low, guttural growl. "You are part of this, Catherine. You always were." Catherine's eyes widened as the figure drew nearer. She could feel the tendrils of its influence creeping into her mind, making her doubt her every thought, her every action. She felt herself slipping, her resolve faltering. But she couldn't let go, not now. Not when she was so close. With a defiant cry, Catherine raised the pendant high, the light from it blinding in its intensity. The shadows recoiled, howling in pain, but the figure pressed on, undeterred. It was almost as if it fed on the light, growing stronger with every pulse. "You're wrong," Catherine whispered, her voice shaking but steady. "This ends with me. You don't control me. Not anymore." In that moment, the pendant flared brighter than it ever had before, a blinding explosion of light that filled the entire garden. The shadows screamed, their form unraveling, disintegrating into the air. The figure, now distorted and frenzied, screamed in rage as its body began to fade, its outline flickering like a dying ember. Catherine felt the surge of energy flood through her, the power of the pendant coursing through her veins. She could hear the distant voice of Emily once more, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't the desperate, distorted plea she had heard before. This time it was clear. It was her daughter's voice, soft and full of love. "Mom," Emily's voice was calm, soothing. "Thank you." The garden began to shift, the darkness dissipating like mist in the morning sun. The moonlight returned, bathing the landscape in its gentle glow. The oppressive weight that had hung over Catherine's shoulders for so long vanished, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe. But even as the shadows retreated, Catherine knew that this was not the end. The pendant pulsed one last time, its glow fading, leaving only the faintest trace of light behind. The garden was still now, silent and peaceful, but the horrors that had taken place here would never truly fade. The house still loomed in the distance, its secrets still buried beneath the surface, waiting for the next soul to awaken them. As Catherine turned to leave, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. Emily was safe for now, but the darkness would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next unwitting soul to stumble into its grasp. She took one last look at the house, then turned away, walking into the night. Catherine's footsteps echoed in the silent night as she walked away from the house, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened, what she had just faced. The garden, the figure, the pendant, it all seemed like a nightmare that she could barely remember. But the one thing she was certain of, the one thing that kept her moving forward, was that Emily was safe. For now. The air felt different now. The heavy, oppressive weight had lifted, leaving behind a strange stillness, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath and was holding it. Catherine's eyes glanced nervously toward the horizon, her senses on high alert. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. Whatever the house had been, whatever the forces at play had been, it was over. The darkness was no longer clinging to her. But as she walked further into the night, she realized that the journey was far from over. The path before her stretched out, winding through the quiet streets of the town. The houses were dark, their windows empty, as though the world had slipped into a deep sleep. Yet, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, something just beyond the veil of night. It was as if the darkness, though gone from the house, had followed her, lingering in the corners of her vision, in the spaces between the trees. Her fingers brushed against the pendant once more, the cool metal grounding her, reminding her that she had a connection, a tether, to something beyond the horror, beyond the chaos. The pendant had been a lifeline, a beacon in the darkest of times. But now, in the silence of the night, it felt like a burden. Something more was at play here, something she didn't fully understand. As she walked, she could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the whisper of branches swaying in the breeze. It was peaceful, but not the kind of peace that calms the soul. It was the peace of something waiting, something hidden just beneath the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable return of the darkness. Her thoughts turned to Emily. Her daughter had been taken, had been caught in the web of this malevolent force. Catherine had found her again, but there was no denying that the bond between them had been changed, fractured even. Emily's voice had been so different when she spoke through the pendant. It hadn't sounded like the girl she had raised. It had sounded more like something else, something ancient, something that had always been there. She looked ahead and saw the familiar outline of her house in the distance. It stood there waiting for her, but now it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Her heart quickened as she approached the door, the memories of the horrors she had faced flooding her mind. The garden, the figure, the whispers, they would always haunt her, always be with her. She could never fully escape the things she had seen. They had changed her in ways she could not yet understand. As she stepped over the threshold, The familiar creak of the door seemed almost comforting. But there was something different now. The house felt off. The air was thick with a subtle tension, as if the walls were watching her, listening. She glanced around, half expecting to see the figure in the garden lurking just beyond the window, but it was gone. The darkness had receded for the moment, but the quiet was unnerving. The stillness that had once been a welcome refuge now felt unnatural. Catherine moved through the house, her eyes scanning each room, searching for any signs of what had happened. The furniture was in its usual place, the familiar scent of dust and wood filling the air. But something was wrong. She could feel it. The energy in the house was different, heavier, charged with an invisible force. Her gaze fell upon the mirror in the hallway. It was old, ornate, its surface slightly fogged with age. But when Catherine's eyes met her reflection, she froze. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale, as though she had aged years in the span of hours. Her eyes were wide, haunted, dark circles beneath them, her pupils dilated with fear. She looked like someone who had been through hell, and perhaps in some ways she had. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. It was the figure behind her. A shadow. It was faint at first, just a flicker, but as Catherine watched, it grew more distinct. It was tall, like the figure in the garden, cloaked in darkness. Its form was shifting, flickering like a candle in the wind. But unlike before, when it had been still, this shadow was moving. It was slowly, deliberately closing in on her. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure's shape became clearer. It was as if it were a part of the house, a living extension of the darkness that had taken root here. It was there in the reflection, but when Catherine turned, it vanished. Her heart pounded in her chest as she spun around, searching the room. There was no one there. Nothing. But the air had shifted again. She could feel it. The house was alive with it. The presence. The thing. It was here. And this time it wasn't waiting. It was watching her, following her every move. Catherine moved swiftly through the house, her steps quickening as the panic began to rise in her chest. She could hear the whispers again, faint at first, then louder, filling the air, curling around her thoughts like tendrils of smoke. "You're not safe," they hissed. "You never were." Her pulse quickened, and she broke into a run, her feet pounding the floor as she raced toward the stairs. But she stopped at the bottom, her gaze falling upon the front door. It was open, not wide, but just enough for her to see the shadows beyond. The garden, and the figure, the same one, still waiting. "Come back," it whispered. Catherine's chest tightened, and she stepped back, her mind racing. There was nowhere left to run. The darkness was everywhere. Catherine stood frozen, her back against the door, eyes locked on the garden beyond. The figure in the distance was still there, its hooded form barely discernible in the moonlight. It hadn't moved, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough, its mere existence enough to paralyze her. The whispering grew louder again, the voices rising from the cracks in the walls, the corners of the rooms, each one more urgent, more insistent. "Come back, come back, come back to us." Her heart hammered in her chest, the cold, suffocating fear wrapping its fingers around her throat. The pendant, the only thing that had protected her before, was still clutched in her hand, but it no longer felt like enough. The light it emitted seemed weak now, like a fading star in a blackened sky. It was losing its power, slipping away from her, leaving her vulnerable once again. She glanced over her shoulder, her gaze darting to the stairs, the second floor where Emily had once slept. The house was still too still. The silence was deafening now, and it filled the space with a sense of dread so deep it threatened to consume her. It wasn't just the house that felt alive, it was the very air itself. the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her, watching her every move. Catherine shook her head, forcing herself to breathe. She couldn't let herself lose control. Not again. Not after everything she had fought through. She had come this far. Emily was still out there, still alive, still waiting for her. But she had to act quickly. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, it wouldn't stop until it had her, and Emily back. Her gaze flickered toward the open door again. The garden lay just beyond, an eerie quiet having settled over it. The figure was still there, unmoving, but it was waiting. She knew that now. It was waiting for her to make her next move. Her fingers tightened around the pendant, and with a determined breath, she took a step forward. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, echoing in her ears as if they were inside her mind. "You are part of us. You always were." "No," Catherine whispered, shaking her head. "No, I am not." The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. And with that declaration, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of something else, something that wasn't fear or hopelessness. It was defiance, a fire that burned beneath her skin, igniting a spark she didn't know she still had. The house responded. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, as if the very structure of the house was alive, responding to her resistance. The whispers surged louder now, a cacophony of voices crashing against her mind, but she stood firm, her feet planted in place. Her grip on the pendant tightened even more, and a strange warmth began to spread through her. "You think you can fight us?" The figure in the garden crooned, its voice now dripping with malice, with an unsettling calm. "You cannot escape. You are one of us. You have always been." Catherine gritted her teeth. She could feel the darkness pushing against her, but she wouldn't let it win. She wouldn't let it take her daughter again. Not after everything they had been through. She took another step forward, her eyes never leaving the figure in the garden. The whispers seemed to swirl around her, pulling at her, tugging at her thoughts, but she could feel herself pushing them back. She could fight this. She had to. But as she stepped into the doorway, ready to face whatever lay beyond, the air changed again. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent. Catherine froze. For a moment, she thought maybe the nightmare was over. That somehow the thing, the presence, had been defeated. She took a cautious step toward the gate, her eyes still scanning the garden. But as she looked closer, she saw something that made her heart stop in her chest. The figure was not alone. There were others. Shadows, more figures, their forms indistinct like dark smoke, were emerging from the garden, emerging from the corners of her vision. They moved slowly, their presence like a wave rising from the earth, crawling toward her. There were too many to count, and they weren't human. They weren't anything that could be described in any language. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat as they moved closer, each one flickering like a dying flame, but they were real. They were here, and they were not just waiting. They were hungry. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she had to do. She couldn't wait any longer. She had no choice. The pendant. It had to be the key. It had to be the answer. She raised it high, the soft glow barely visible in the dense darkness around her. The light pulsed again, weak and flickering, but still alive. "No more," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "This ends here." The shadows hesitated for a moment. For the briefest second, it felt as if they were faltering, uncertain. But that hesitation was enough. Catherine didn't wait. She ran. Her feet pounded against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the house as she raced toward the stairs. She could hear them behind her, moving, shifting, the air thick with their presence. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Emily was counting on her. The second floor was just as she remembered it, yet something was off. The air felt cold, biting, and as she approached Emily's room, the door creaked open on its own. A shadow moved within. Her heart sank. There, standing at the edge of Emily's bed, was the figure, the one from the garden. It turned slowly, its face still hidden beneath its hood, but Catherine could feel its gaze on her. It was watching her, waiting. "Emily?" Catherine whispered, her voice cracking. "Emily, please." The figure didn't move, but as Catherine stepped into the room, she saw a shape shift within the shadows. Something small, something familiar. It was Emily, but it wasn't her. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the room. The figure, cloaked in darkness, stood motionless at the foot of Emily's bed. Her heart raced as she focused on the small shape huddled beneath the covers. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. But the girl in the bed wasn't moving. She wasn't even breathing. Catherine's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move forward, her eyes locked on her daughter's form. As she reached the bed, she could feel the temperature in the room drop. The air had become suffocating, like the very life had been drained from it. "Emily?" Catherine called again, her voice trembling, but the girl remained motionless. The shadows around her flickered, growing more pronounced, more alive, twisting in unnatural shapes. Catherine's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her bones. This wasn't her daughter. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen, and the figure at the foot of the bed tilted its head slowly, a movement so deliberate it sent a chill down Catherine's spine. She tried to take a step forward, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place. She looked down at the pendant still clutched tightly in her hand, its faint light flickering as though it too was struggling against the darkness. "What do you want?" Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible, almost drowned out by the oppressive silence that had taken over the room. The figure's voice came from within the shadows, its tone low and mocking. "She is ours now. She was always meant to be ours." Catherine's stomach churned. The word struck her like a physical blow, and she felt the room spin as her thoughts scattered. Always meant to be ours? What did it mean? What had happened to her daughter? Was this thing really Emily? The shadows moved again, swirling around her, but Catherine forced herself to focus. She couldn't fall apart. She had to save Emily. She had to save herself. With every ounce of strength she had left, Catherine reached for the pendant. The light flickered again, but this time it felt more responsive, more intense. Her grip tightened, and she whispered fiercely, "No. She is my daughter, and you will not have her." The darkness around her seemed to recoil slightly, as if the pendant's light had burned it, but the figure did not move. Instead, it stood motionless, its presence overpowering. "You are too late," it hissed. "She belongs to us. The pact was made long ago. You cannot break it now." Catherine could feel the pull, a deep, magnetic force that was tugging at her very soul, trying to draw her closer to the figure. It was as though the shadows were alive, as if they were hungry for her to step forward, to surrender to them. But Catherine resisted. She had come too far to turn back now. "No," she said again, stronger this time. "You won't have her. Not today." The pendant pulsed in her hand, glowing brighter, a beacon of light that sliced through the darkness. Catherine could feel it working, the connection between the light and the shadows becoming a tug of war, each pulling in opposite directions. But the darkness wasn't done yet. With a sharp, sudden movement, the figure in front of her stepped toward the bed, its form expanding, growing larger, swallowing up the room with its presence. The walls seemed to close in, the air becoming thick and suffocating once again. The shadows twisted and coiled around Catherine, threatening to engulf her, to pull her into the depths of its own nightmare. "You don't understand," The figure growled, its voice growing louder, more frantic. She was never yours to protect. She was always ours. Always. The temperature in the room dropped further, and Catherine felt a coldness deep within her bones. The shadows swirled around her, their tendrils reaching for her, pulling her, and as they did, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it take Emily. Not again. Get away from her! Catherine screamed, the force of her voice shaking the very foundation of the house. She raised the pendant higher, its light now blinding, a brilliant, white-hot beam that cut through the darkness like a sword. The shadows screamed, but it wasn't the shadows that shrank back. It was the figure. It recoiled from the light, its form shifting violently, as if trying to escape the blinding rays. The room trembled with the force of it, and for a brief moment, Catherine felt a flicker of hope. Could it really be that easy? Could the light of the pendant destroy the figure that had tormented her? But as quickly as that hope had appeared, it vanished. The figure let out a guttural, inhuman scream that rattled the windows and sent a wave of nausea crashing over Catherine. The shadows twisted into impossible shapes, becoming too vast to contain. The figure's form collapsed, flickering, struggling against the light, but it was clear now. It wasn't going down without a fight. The room seemed to split in two. The light from the pendant pushed the shadows back, but at the same time, the darkness clawed at her, forcing her to her knees. Catherine gritted her teeth, fighting the crushing pressure, but she could feel her strength slipping. And then, from the bed, came a sound that froze her blood. A soft giggle. Not Emily's, but something else. Something wrong. Catherine's head snapped toward the bed, and her eyes widened in horror. The girl lying there, the one who had looked like her daughter, was now changing. Her features twisted, elongated, as though she were being pulled apart, reshaped into something unrecognizable. Her eyes were wide open now, but they weren't Emily's eyes. They were black, soulless pits, and they glowed faintly in the dim light. The thing that had once been Emily, or at least had appeared to be, smiled at her, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Mommy, I'm so hungry." Catherine recoiled in horror as the creature in her daughter's bed writhed, stretching unnaturally, its limbs twisting in impossible angles. The darkness surged again, more powerful this time, and the room filled with the shrill sound of something moving beneath the skin of the house. The shadows reached for her, but Catherine was no longer thinking. She was acting. With a cry of defiance, she hurled the pendant directly at the creature. The light exploded upon contact, a brilliant burst of energy that lit up the entire room. For a moment, everything went silent. The room stood still. For a single, breathless moment, the darkness paused, as though it were holding its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The pendant's light filled every corner of the room, illuminating the grotesque figure that had once been her daughter, its twisted smile frozen on its monstrous face. And then the silence shattered. The explosion of light was like a wave crashing against a cliff. The shadows recoiled violently, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke and vapor, vanishing into the air like dust in the wind. The creature, Emily's doppelganger, let out a shrill, ear-piercing screech, its twisted body flailing as if it were being torn apart from the inside out. Catherine felt the force of the light reverberating through her, lifting her off her feet and sending her tumbling backwards into the room's far wall. She gasped for breath, disoriented and dazed, the air thick with the remnants of the darkness that had once consumed the room. She pushed herself to her hands and knees, her fingers trembling as she reached out toward the pendant, still glowing faintly on the floor. Through the haze of her blurred vision, she saw the creature thrashing in agony. It had collapsed, its body contorting as it tried to escape the burning light. The once soft, human-like features of Emily's form were now utterly grotesque. Its face had elongated, its skin splitting apart, revealing something far more horrifying beneath. Its eyes were wide, black holes that seemed to suck in the very light around it. Catherine's breath caught in her throat, and she pulled herself forward, reaching for the pendant. As her fingers brushed against the cool surface, the light flared brighter, and the creature's screams grew louder, more desperate. "No," it rasped, its voice barely recognizable as human. "You cannot do this. You cannot destroy us." The shadows in the room writhed and swirled, but Catherine's grip on the pendant tightened, and with a desperate, final effort, she pulled it from the ground and held it high above her head. "I will," she screamed, her voice cracking with the weight of the declaration. She could feel the energy of the pendant coursing through her, feeding off her determination, growing stronger with each passing second. The creature recoiled, its twisted form beginning to disintegrate in the light. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with the energy emanating from the pendant, and the house itself groaned in response, as though it, too, were feeling the force of the battle raging between light and darkness. But just as Catherine thought the end was near, just as she believed the nightmare might finally be over, everything shifted. The room trembled. A deafening roar erupted from the depths of the house, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A fissure appeared in the floorboards, and from it, something else began to emerge. The light from the pendant flickered, its power waning as the darkness surged once again, filling the room with a weight so oppressive it threatened to crush her. The creature that had once been Emily's form twisted in midair, and with a terrifying, unnatural speed, it lunged at Catherine, its twisted hands reaching for her throat. But just before it could make contact, the light from the pendant flared one final time, expanding outward in a blinding burst that sent the creature flying backward, crashing into the far wall. And that's when Catherine saw it. Emerging from the fissure in the floor was a shape, a figure. It was tall, its form cloaked in the same suffocating shadows that had filled the house. Unlike the creature, this figure didn't writhe or distort. It stood still, its presence commanding, as though it were the source of everything. It was ancient, its form humanoid but not quite human. Its eyes glowed with a faint, sickly green light, and its mouth stretched in a grotesque, endless smile. "So you think you can destroy us?" it hissed, its voice low and guttural, reverberating through the very air. "You are nothing, Catherine. You are nothing but a tool, a pawn in a game far beyond your comprehension." Catherine's heart raced, but her hand remained steady, the pendant still glowing fiercely in her grasp. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let this thing win. Emily was still out there. She had to save her. With a determined breath, she raised the pendant higher, focusing all her strength on the light. The figure in the shadows sneered at her, but Catherine's resolve did not waver. She would not let it take Emily. She would not let it take her. "Leave this place," Catherine said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Leave us alone." The figure's smile twisted into a more sinister grin, and it stepped forward, the shadows around it swirling like a storm. "You don't understand. You can never escape us. We are eternal. We are the darkness, and you are merely a flicker in our path." The shadows thickened around it, growing stronger, but Catherine didn't falter. She stepped forward, holding the pendant as high as she could, letting the light from it blaze through the room. For a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something in the figure's eyes. Fear, perhaps? No. It was too confident, too sure of its power. But Catherine had learned something in all of this. She had learned that fear, even ancient fear, could be overcome. The pendant's light flared again, blinding and powerful. The figure staggered back, its form flickering, as if it couldn't withstand the power of the pendant. "No, this cannot be," it whispered, its voice crackling. And then, with a final desperate cry, it collapsed into the shadows, disappearing completely, leaving nothing but a heavy silence in its wake. Catherine stood there, breathless and trembling, the pendant still glowing faintly in her hand. The room was still again, and as the shadows dissipated, she looked toward the bed, where the grotesque form of the creature had been. Emily's body was gone, but where the creature had been, there was now a small, fragile figure sitting in the middle of the bed. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, but she was breathing. Alive. "Mommy!" Emily's voice was soft, fragile, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. Catherine's heart soared, and she rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into her arms, her tears falling freely now. "Emily, you're safe," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with relief. She kissed her daughter's forehead, her hands shaking as she held her tight. "I'm here. I'm so sorry." Emily clung to her mother, her small body shaking with the weight of everything that had happened. But in that moment, Catherine didn't care about the darkness that had filled their home. She didn't care about the price they had paid. All that mattered was that her daughter was in her arms, safe, and the nightmare was finally over. For a moment, the house was silent, save for the soft sounds of Catherine's breathing and the gentle, reassuring hum of the pendant in her hand. The shadows that had once filled every corner of the house had receded, leaving only the faintest traces behind, like wisps of smoke lingering in the air. Emily clung to her mother, her tiny hands trembling against Catherine's chest. Catherine held her daughter close, wrapping her arms around the girl protectively, trying to shield her from the horrors they had both just endured. The house felt different now, less oppressive, as though the air itself had shifted, lightened. Yet, in the back of Catherine's mind, a lingering question gnawed at her. Was it truly over? She glanced down at the pendant still in her hand. The once brilliant glow had dulled to a soft, almost imperceptible light, like the dying embers of a fire. Catherine's grip tightened around it, a surge of anxiety racing through her. She didn't know if the pendant had been the key to their survival, or if it had only delayed the inevitable. Either way, something deep inside her told her that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It couldn't be. Not entirely. "Mommy!" Emily's voice was quiet, fragile, but it was the sound Catherine had longed to hear for what felt like an eternity. Catherine brushed the hair from Emily's face, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. We're safe now." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened, why it had happened. What had that thing been? What had it wanted with her daughter? "Emily," Catherine's voice was soft but firm as she gently pulled back just enough to look into her daughter's eyes. "What do you remember?" Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. She blinked several times, her eyes wide, as though she were trying to grasp the fragments of her own memory. I don't remember much, Mommy. I remember feeling really cold, and then everything went dark. I was so scared. But then, I don't know. It was like I was somewhere else. Somewhere far away." Catherine held her daughter tighter, her heart breaking for the terror Emily had endured, for the nightmare that had been forced upon her. But what worried Catherine more was that she didn't remember anything about the time that had passed either. Had it been hours? Days? Had she been fighting the darkness for far longer than she realized? How had she even been able to find her daughter again? "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine said, trying to steady her own voice. "But we're going to figure it out. We'll figure everything out, I promise you." She kissed Emily's forehead, her mind racing, her pulse still pounding in her ears. She needed to get out of here. She needed to leave this house before whatever had been lurking in the shadows returned. If the house had truly been a battleground for the forces of darkness, who was to say they wouldn't strike again? Catherine looked around the room, half expecting the shadows to re-emerge, but the air felt clear now. The tension had lifted. The oppressive weight of fear that had plagued them for so long was finally beginning to subside, though it left behind a lingering sense of unease, like the aftermath of a storm. Slowly, she helped Emily to her feet, keeping her close. "Let's go, baby. We're getting out of here." Emily nodded without question, her small hand gripping Catherine's tightly, as though she knew instinctively that they needed to leave. Together, they moved toward the door, but as they stepped into the hallway, Catherine froze. A faint sound echoed from below, the creak of floorboards. Slow, deliberate, a soft whisper of movement. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned toward Emily, her heart racing. "Stay close to me," she whispered urgently. Emily nodded again, her wide eyes filled with fear. Catherine's grip tightened on her daughter's hand as they slowly crept toward the stairs, every sense on high alert. The house was still, too still. As they descended the stairs, Catherine's mind raced, every shadow seeming to twist and warp as they passed it. The warmth of the house, the feeling of safety she had been clinging to, was quickly being replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread. There was something wrong. There was something else here. At the bottom of the stairs, Catherine froze. A figure stood in the doorway. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked on the silhouette, its shape still blurred by the dim light coming from the hallway behind her. But there was no mistaking it. It was a man. His presence was tall, imposing, and as he stepped closer, Catherine's breath hitched. He was wearing a long coat, his face obscured by shadows. But his eyes glowed faintly, like two embers burning in the dark. And as he stepped closer, he seemed to float, his feet never quite touching the ground, as though he was a shadow himself, cast from the darkness that surrounded them. "Who are you?" Catherine whispered, fear rising in her chest once more. The man said nothing at first. He simply stood there, his form so solid that it felt like the very air around them had thickened, like it was suffocating them both. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, and Catherine could feel her pulse racing. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was low, melodic, but there was something chilling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of Catherine's neck stand on end. "You think you've escaped," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "But you haven't. Not really. You've only delayed the inevitable." Catherine's heart sank as the reality of his words began to sink in. The shadows hadn't been vanquished. The house hadn't been freed. This man, this thing, was the true force behind everything. The one who had been pulling the strings all along. "What do you want from us?" Catherine demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want with my daughter?" The man's smile was cold, empty. "She is the key. She has always been the key. And now, you will be part of the sacrifice." Catherine felt her stomach lurch at his words, the truth slowly dawning on her. He was not merely some specter. He was the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the horrors that had plagued their lives. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Not again. "No," Catherine spat, her grip tightening on Emily's hand. "I will protect her no matter what." The figure's smile widened, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone, vanishing into thin air, leaving nothing but a chill behind. Catherine stared at the spot where he had stood, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Catherine's body trembled with adrenaline, but she didn't have time to dwell on the man's cryptic words. She pulled Emily closer, her mind racing. The terror of their encounter had left her shaken, but she knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. The figure's threat echoed in her mind, a dark omen of what was to come. The sacrifice, She couldn't let it happen. Not to Emily. "We need to go right now," Catherine said, her voice steady but urgent as she led Emily through the hallway, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow for movement. The house felt alive, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The front door loomed ahead, but Catherine's heart sank as they approached it. The door, which had once been a symbol of safety, now seemed like an insurmountable barrier. The air in the house had grown thick again, almost suffocating. She had to get them out, but something told her that the front door might not be the answer anymore. The air seemed heavier, the darkness swirling around them, closing in like an invisible trap. Emily's grip tightened on her hand, her small fingers trembling with fear. Catherine glanced down at her daughter's pale face and forced a smile, trying to reassure her. "We're almost there, sweetie. Just a little further." But as they neared the door, it happened. The room, once familiar and comforting, seemed to shift. The walls seemed to contract inward, pulling them into a shrinking space. The floor beneath their feet trembled, and the very air around them seemed to hum with a strange energy. Catherine froze, her eyes darting around as she tried to understand what was happening. It wasn't just the house, it was the world around them. "Mommy, I don't like this," Emily whispered, her voice small and frightened. She clung to Catherine's side, her eyes wide with terror. "I know, baby," Catherine whispered back, her voice barely a breath. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but something held her in place, an oppressive force that made every movement feel like it was being dragged through molasses. The pendant in her hand felt heavier, colder. Before she could react, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. A cold wind swept through the house, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. No voices from the darkness. "You can't escape," the voice hissed, slithering around them like smoke. "You will be part of the endless cycle. You will be part of the darkness." The sound echoed through the house, but there was no source, no figure. It was just the voice, everywhere and nowhere all at once. Catherine's breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears as the room seemed to close in on them. The walls pressed tighter and tighter, as though the house itself were alive, suffocating them in its grasp. "Emily, hold on to me, baby," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to move them forward. The door was just a few feet away, but it felt as though it were miles distant. The world around them was warping, bending at unnatural angles, as if the house itself were distorting time and space. And then, the floor beneath them cracked open. A massive, jagged fissure split the ground, sending a shockwave of cold air into the room. Catherine stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance, but she held on to Emily, shielding her from the gaping hole that had suddenly appeared before them. From the chasm, a figure began to rise. It was not the man from before, but something far older, far darker. Its form was obscured, hidden by the swirling darkness that emanated from it. But Catherine could feel it, the presence. It was something ancient, something far beyond the scope of human understanding. It didn't belong in this world. "You cannot fight what is eternal," the voice whispered again, but this time it came from the figure itself. Catherine's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the dark shape slowly rising from the fissure. It was like a nightmare, an entity that defied explanation. Its very being seemed to stretch the limits of reality, bending and twisting in unnatural ways, as though the laws of physics and nature were being rewritten in front of her eyes. The darkness around it was palpable, and Catherine felt her breath hitch. This was it. This was what had been waiting for them. Her pulse raced. She had no idea how to fight something like this, but she wouldn't give up. Not after everything they had been through. Not after what she had already lost. "We need to get out," Catherine said, the words coming out in a strangled gasp. She turned away from the figure and started pulling Emily toward the door, but the very air seemed to resist them. The walls, the floor, everything was pushing them back. "No!" The voice boomed, its tone vibrating the very foundation of the house. The darkness pressed in closer, and the temperature dropped, sending a chill straight through Catherine's bones. "You cannot leave. This house is mine. Your souls belong to me now." Suddenly, the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting crack, trapping them inside. Catherine gasped, her heart sinking. The air grew colder still, her breath visible in the freezing temperature. And then, the floor beneath their feet cracked again, this time sending fissures spreading across the room. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker. "Catherine," Emily whispered, her voice small and terrified. "What do we do?" Catherine's eyes darted frantically, searching for a way out. The room was closing in. The shadows were suffocating them, and the air was thick with a malevolent presence. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. "What do I do?" And then it hit her. The pendant. The pendant had been the only source of light in this nightmare. The only thing that had been able to push back the darkness. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "Hold on, baby," Catherine said, her voice filled with a renewed determination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pendant, feeling its weight in her hand. The light was dim now, barely a flicker of what it had been earlier. But Catherine wasn't about to give up. She closed her eyes, clutching the pendant tight, and whispered the only words that felt right. "Please help us." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the pendant flared to life. The pendant erupted with a bright, blinding light that seemed to cut through the suffocating darkness like a knife. Catherine winced, her hand shielding her eyes, but she refused to look away. The room trembled as the light grew stronger, brighter, pushing back the oppressive shadows that had seemed to close in around them. Emily gasped, her wide eyes reflecting the radiant glow. "Mommy, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice filled with both wonder and fear. "It's the pendant," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "It's going to protect us. We just need to hold on." The darkness writhed and recoiled, as if the light itself were a living force, battling back the malevolent energy that had infested the house. The figure that had emerged from the chasm in the floor shrieked in fury, its shadowy form twisting violently as the light from the pendant washed over it. But Catherine knew this wasn't over. The house might be pushing back the shadows for now, but it wouldn't be long before they returned. Whatever this entity was, whatever had tied it to the pendant, it was only a matter of time before it found a way to reclaim the house, and them. The room began to vibrate violently, a deep, resonating hum emanating from the very walls. The floor beneath them cracked even wider, sending fissures that glowed with an unnatural, crimson light. The temperature dropped further, and Catherine's breath became visible in the freezing air. "Mommy, we need to leave," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around, her small body shaking with fear. Catherine nodded, her mind racing. "I know, baby. We're getting out of here. But first, we need to stop this." She held the pendant tightly in her hand, focusing on the power it emitted. She couldn't help but wonder how long this light would last. It had already begun to dim, its warmth and brilliance fading with each passing second. "Stay close to me," Catherine instructed, pulling Emily tightly against her side. "We're going to find a way to stop this." As she spoke, a deafening crash filled the room as the walls cracked further, breaking apart in chunks as the very structure of the house began to collapse in on itself. The door that had once seemed like a way out was now barely visible through the swirling chaos, its frame bent and splintered. Catherine's heart raced as the shadows seemed to gather once more, reforming in the dark corners of the room. They weren't just shadows, They were voices, whispers that grew louder with every passing moment. The same voice from before, the one that had taunted them, sounded from all directions, a cacophony of ominous echoes that rattled the walls. You cannot escape. The house will claim you. You will become part of the endless void, just as all those before you. Catherine gritted her teeth, her pulse pounding in her ears. The light from the pendant flickered again, just as the walls around them seemed to shudder with the force of some unseen pressure. There is no escape, Catherine. The air thickened, and it felt like the entire house was closing in around them, the walls and floors bending with unnatural force. The once sturdy structure was buckling, as though it were made of paper. Every crack and creak was like a warning, telling them that time was running out. But Catherine didn't falter. She couldn't. Not with Emily by her side. The pendant was their last hope, the only thing that could protect them. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and reached out, calling upon the power of the pendant once more. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the raging chaos around them. "Please help us." As if in response to her desperate plea, the pendant flared once again, its light blinding in its intensity. The shadows writhed in agony, their forms warping and twisting violently, but they didn't dissipate. The light wasn't enough to banish them completely. Not yet. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the weight of the moment crash down upon her. She wasn't sure how much longer the pendant would hold out against the darkness. But she couldn't let it go. Not now. The darkness is infinite, Catherine. You cannot defeat it. The voice sounded once more, louder, more insistent, but this time there was something else in it, something ancient and full of malice. Suddenly, the shadows coiled tighter, converging on the pendant, a dark mass that seemed to consume everything in its path. Catherine felt a sharp chill run down her spine as the light from the pendant flickered again, its power draining. And then, in that instant of vulnerability, a dark tendril shot out from the mass of shadows, striking the pendant. Catherine screamed as the pendant wrenched itself from her grip, torn from her hand by the dark force. It flew through the air, spinning violently, and landed with a dull thud on the floor several feet away, its light snuffed out entirely. The house seemed to shudder in unison, the shadows now fully encompassing the room. It felt like the very air around them had thickened, suffocating them, as the darkness enveloped them completely. The floor beneath their feet buckled with an inhuman force, sending cracks racing through the walls. Catherine fell to her knees, panic surging in her chest. "No, no, no!" she cried, reaching out for the pendant. But it was too late. Emily clung to her mother's side, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Mommy, what do we do? We can't stay here." Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her mind racing. The pendant was their only hope, their only protection. Without it, the darkness would consume them. She had to act. She had to. And then something strange happened. A soft, melodic hum filled the air, a distant and comforting sound. The shadows, though still dark and oppressive, seemed to pause for just a moment. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, if only slightly, as though the presence of the pendant hadn't entirely disappeared. There was still something there. Catherine's head snapped up, her heart racing. She turned to see a faint, ghostly figure standing at the threshold of the room. It was the figure from the door. But now it was no longer the menacing entity from before. This time it was different, more human, more real. The figure was dressed in simple, worn clothing, and its face was gentle, filled with a quiet sadness. The figure spoke, its voice like a soft whisper on the wind. "You are not alone." Catherine stared, disbelief seizing her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond directly. Instead, it stepped forward, walking toward them with a slow, deliberate grace. The shadows seemed to part slightly in its presence, as though they feared this new figure. You have come far, Catherine. You have faced the darkness and survived. But there is still more to do. The house is only one part of the puzzle. The darkness you face is not contained here. It has roots beyond this place. It is not finished. Catherine's heart raced as she watched the figure approach. The soft hum of its presence filled the room, cutting through the suffocating air, offering her a glimmer of hope, however faint it may be. The shadows that had once enveloped the house now seemed to pull back, just enough to give them a fleeting chance. Who are you?" Catherine asked again, her voice trembling, her eyes scanning the figure in front of her. She couldn't place it. This wasn't the same man who had confronted them earlier, nor was it any of the twisted forms that had haunted the house. The figure's face remained soft and melancholic, though there was a knowing sadness in its eyes, as though it had seen too much. Its gaze settled on Catherine and Emily, and it spoke in a tone that was barely above a whisper, but its words were clear. "I am someone who has seen what is to come, and I am someone who has failed before." Catherine felt a shiver crawl up her spine, her instincts telling her to step back, to run. But there was something about this figure, something about its presence, that felt strangely comforting, even as the overwhelming weight of fear and confusion pressed down on her. The figure continued, its voice a steady cadence that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "This house, it was never meant to be what you think. It is not just a structure. It is an anchor, a place where the dark forces of the world converge. It is tied to something greater, something older than you can imagine. And it is through this place that the darkness is trying to enter this world." The words made no sense. Catherine could barely comprehend them. The house an anchor? The darkness trying to enter the world? She turned to Emily, who was still clutching her side, looking up at the figure with wide, fearful eyes. "Mommy," Emily whispered, her voice so small in the midst of the chaos. "What does it mean? What's going to happen?" Catherine's heart ached. She wished she could offer her daughter comfort, but the truth was too terrifying. The house, the shadows, the figure, they all seemed to point to something much bigger, something she had no control over. The figure took another step forward, its ethereal form appearing to shimmer with a soft, almost imperceptible glow. It reached out its hand, not toward Catherine, but toward the pendant. "The pendant is a key, Catherine. It is the last of its kind, and it holds within it the power to close the door." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "Close the door? What door? What do you mean?" The figure's face remained somber, its eyes searching Catherine's with an intensity that made her feel as though it could see every thought in her mind. "The door you've opened, the one that brings forth the darkness, it is not a physical door. It is a rift between worlds, a tear that is threatening to widen. Your presence here, your connection to this house, has bound you to this struggle. You must close the rift, or else everything you know will be swallowed by the shadows." The figure's words weighed heavily on Catherine's chest. The rift, a tear between worlds? She had thought that the terror they were facing was just a haunting, something tied to the house itself. But this was bigger. It was something beyond her comprehension. "What do you want me to do?" Catherine asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The figure paused, its eyes flickering briefly to the pendant still lying on the ground, its light flickering weakly. "The pendant must be returned to its rightful place. Only then will the rift begin to close. But be warned, when you take it back, the house will resist. The darkness will fight to keep the rift open. And the cost?" It trailed off, as if the weight of the words were too much to bear. Catherine's mind spun with the implications. What cost? What was she about to face? The figure took a deep breath, and Catherine could feel the tension in the air, the quiet, impending storm. The cost will be great, but if you do not act, the world you know will be lost. Catherine clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. There was no choice. Emily needed her, and she couldn't let the darkness win. The figure's words filled her with a cold certainty. The house, the pendant, the shadows, they were all pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that she had no choice but to solve. "How do I return it?" Catherine asked, her voice tight with fear and determination. The figure's gaze softened. "There is a place within the house, hidden deep within its foundations. The pendant must be placed there, where the shadows cannot reach. Only then will the rift begin to close. But once the pendant is returned, the house will fight with all its might. It will try to keep you here." Catherine looked at Emily, who was still clinging to her, her small body trembling with fear. Catherine knelt down to her level, cupping her daughter's face with shaking hands. "We're gonna fix this, okay? Just stay close to me. Don't let go, no matter what happens." Emily nodded, her tear-streaked face filled with trust and fear. "I won't, Mommy. I'll stay with you." The figure gave them one last look, its face filled with sorrow. "Be brave, Catherine. The house will test you. But remember, you are not alone." With that, the figure faded into the shadows, its form dissipating like smoke on the wind. The room, which had been thick with oppressive energy, seemed to lighten, just a little. The oppressive force was still there, but for the first time, Catherine felt like she had a chance. She grabbed Emily's hand and stood, her gaze hardening with determination. The pendant, the key, was still just within reach. But now the true challenge began. Without another word, Catherine turned, leading Emily towards the darkened hallway. Each step felt like a battle as the walls around them seemed to close in. The shadows whispered from every corner, their voices still faint but growing louder with each passing second. "You cannot leave." The voice was faint at first, like a hiss in the distance, but as they moved deeper into the house, it became clearer, louder, until it was right behind them. "You are mine. This house is mine. You will never leave." Catherine gritted her teeth and pressed forward, her hand wrapped tightly around Emily's. They couldn't stop now, not after everything they had endured. Ahead of them, the hallway twisted and contorted, its once straight path now curving into a maze of endless corridors. It was as if the house itself were mocking them, warping reality to its will. The walls groaned, the air thick with dread, but Catherine knew they had to move quickly. Time was running out. In the distance, she could see a faint glow, the pendant. It was lying in the center of the floor, surrounded by shadows that stretched and shifted as if alive. But it wasn't just the pendant that drew her attention. At the far end of the hallway, something else moved. Something large. Something alive. Catherine froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift in time with her racing heartbeat, drawing her attention to the end of the hallway. The soft, unnatural glow from the pendant flickered in the distance, but it was the presence that loomed beyond it that sent a wave of ice-cold fear through her. Something moved in the shadows, large, dark, and grotesque. The shape was distorted, fluid, as if it were shifting in and out of reality. It loomed just at the edge of her vision, its outline not quite forming, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Emily clung tightly to her mother's side, her small hand trembling in Catherine's grip. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's that? What's there?" Catherine swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't want to answer, but the truth weighed heavily on her. The house, this place, wasn't just haunted. It was alive in some twisted, malevolent way, and whatever was lurking ahead was part of the evil that had infected it. "I don't know," Catherine whispered back, her voice low and trembling. But we have to keep going. They couldn't turn back. Not now. The pendant lay just ahead, its light still faint but undeniable. They had come too far to stop. They moved forward slowly, cautiously, each step echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the sense of something watching them became almost suffocating. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at her thoughts, urging her to turn around. But Catherine couldn't. She couldn't give in to the fear. Not when Emily was depending on her. The shape at the end of the hallway shifted again, growing larger, its form beginning to take on a more distinct outline. It was like a giant mass of darkness, a swirling, inky void that seemed to consume the very light around it. And then, for a brief, horrifying moment, Catherine saw its face. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was a mass of shifting shadows, but in the center, there was a distorted, grotesque face, its eyes wide and empty, as though the darkness itself had taken form. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, its features warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward them, tendrils reaching out like fingers clawing at the air. The temperature in the hallway dropped even further, frost forming on the walls and floor, as if the very presence of this thing was freezing everything it touched. "You cannot escape." The voice echoed, its tone deep and guttural, like something ancient and powerful. The words were a threat, a promise, but Catherine didn't stop. "Stay close, Emily," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. She gripped her daughter's hand even harder, guiding her forward toward the pendant. It was still glowing faintly, but the darkness was pressing in around it, closing in like a trap. They reached the pendant, and Catherine's fingers brushed it, sending a shock of warmth through her body. It wasn't as bright as it had been, but there was still power in it. The warmth of the pendant spread through her like a lifeline, and for a brief moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. But then the shadow surged, lunging forward with a speed that should have been impossible. The dark tendrils lashed out, coiling around Catherine's body, pulling her away from the pendant. Emily screamed in terror, her small voice piercing the thick air of the house. "Mommy!" Catherine struggled, her heart pounding in her chest as the shadows constricted around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She tried to break free, but the darkness was too strong, its grip unyielding. "You cannot save her, Catherine." The voice spoke again, its tone mocking, filled with dark satisfaction. "The house is mine. The rift is mine. You will never leave." Catherine's mind raced as she felt the shadows tightening, their cold fingers wrapping around her throat. She gasped for breath, her eyes darting to Emily, who was still standing just a few feet away, her face twisted in fear. "No!" Catherine cried, fighting harder against the dark grip that held her. "I won't let you take her. I won't let you have us." The pendant. She had to get to the pendant. It was their only hope. But the shadows kept pulling her away, dragging her further into their dark embrace. With a final burst of strength, Catherine twisted her body, breaking free from the tendrils that held her for just a moment. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Emily. "Stay back!" Catherine shouted, her voice raw with fear and urgency. "Don't come near it." The figure at the end of the hallway, the thing, lurched forward, its form rippling like water. The shadows it cast stretched long across the floor, swallowing everything in their path. But Catherine wasn't done. She reached for the pendant once more, her fingers trembling as she grasped it tightly. The moment her fingers closed around it, the light flared back to life, brighter than before. The shadows recoiled, screeching in agony as the light pushed them back. But they were relentless. They couldn't be stopped. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the power of the pendant surging through her, but it was fading. It was as if the house itself was draining the light from the pendant, using it against her. The darkness was closing in. The rift was growing. Catherine looked at Emily, her voice cracking with desperation. "Emily, I need you to listen to me. You have to run. Now. Get out of here." Emily's eyes were wide with terror, but she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not leaving you, Mommy. I'm staying with you." Catherine's heart shattered at her daughter's words. She didn't want to leave her either, but there was no time. The house was collapsing around them. The darkness was too strong. The rift was open, and it was threatening to consume them both. "You cannot win, Catherine." The voice of the darkness boomed, vibrating the walls. The shadows reached for them again, and Catherine knew that time had run out. She had to make a choice. With all the strength she could muster, she pulled Emily close, her arms wrapping around her in a tight embrace. The pendant, the only thing that could stop this, was her last chance. She could feel it pulsing in her hand, the power still lingering within it, but it was slipping. And then, as if the house itself had decided to end the game, the shadows surged forward in one final, overwhelming wave. Catherine closed her eyes, holding Emily tightly against her chest, praying that they wouldn't be consumed by the darkness. The pendant, could it be enough? The darkness hit with the force of a tidal wave, crashing over Catherine and Emily, pulling them into its cold, suffocating embrace. The shadows swirled around them like a living thing, its tendrils wrapping tightly around their bodies. It was as if the house itself had become an entity, a monstrous being intent on dragging them into the depths of its endless void. Catherine gasped for air, her chest tightening as the shadows constricted around her. She could feel the cold seep into her bones, draining the life from her, and yet, the pendant in her hand still pulsed with a faint warmth, a flicker of hope in the midst of the nightmare. "Mommy!" Emily's voice was weak, muffled by the overwhelming darkness that surrounded them. Catherine could barely hear her, but she could feel her daughter's small, trembling body pressed against her own. She wouldn't let go. She couldn't. "Stay close, Emily," Catherine whispered, her voice strained. She clutched the pendant tighter, her knuckles turning white. The shadows seemed to scream in fury around them, a cacophony of tortured whispers that clawed at her mind, threatening to break her. "You cannot escape." The voice boomed, deep and monstrous, reverberating through the walls. The darkness seemed to grow stronger with each passing second, pushing them further into the depths of its grasp. But Catherine refused to give in. She knew they had only one chance to stop this, to close the rift, to end the nightmare that had haunted them from the very beginning. Her heart thundered in her chest as she looked down at the pendant. It was still glowing, faint but steady. She could feel its power, its warmth, even as the darkness fought to extinguish it. "Return it." The voice came again, echoing through the room. "Return the pendant, or you will both be lost forever." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The figure from earlier, the one that had warned her, had said the pendant needed to be placed in the house's foundations. But how could she do that when the very walls themselves were turning against them? The shadows were growing thicker, more suffocating with each passing moment. It was as if the house was alive, feeding on the fear, the despair, the hopelessness that clung to them like a fog. "You cannot leave." The voice taunted, a cruel whisper in her ear. "You're a part of the house now. You belong to the darkness." Catherine's mind raced. She had to find the way to end this, to close the rift before it consumed them completely. Her gaze darted around, searching for something, anything, that might hold the key. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the hallway, hidden in the darkness, was a door. A small, unassuming door, almost invisible in the swirling shadows. Catherine felt a strange pull toward it, a sense of urgency flooding her veins. It was as if the house itself was directing her, guiding her toward this one final destination. "Emily, hold on," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "I think I found a way out." Emily clung to her mother, nodding silently. She didn't understand, but she trusted her completely. They had come this far together. They wouldn't stop now. With one last, desperate push, Catherine fought through the shadows, dragging Emily with her toward the door. The darkness screamed in rage, its tendrils reaching for them, but Catherine's resolve was unshakable. She had to get them through. She had to end this. They reached the door, and Catherine hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the handle. The moment her fingers touched it, the door opened with a low, groaning creak, as though it had been waiting for them all along. Behind it, the room was bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The walls of the room were lined with strange symbols, drawn in what appeared to be blood. The ground beneath them was uneven, cracked, as if something ancient and powerful had been buried there long ago. And there, at the center of the room, was a stone pedestal, bathed in a cold, flickering light. On top of the pedestal lay a darkened, twisted shape, something that looked almost like a hollowed-out stone, but with cracks running through its surface, as though it had been torn apart and reforged countless times. Catherine's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. The pendant, the key to everything, was meant to go here. This was the place. This was where the rift would close. But as Catherine stepped forward, the shadows followed. They were relentless, pouring through the door behind them, their cold fingers crawling up her legs, trying to pull her back into the abyss. "No," the voice screamed, fury lacing every syllable. "You cannot take it back. You belong to me. You belong to this house." The shadows lashed out, striking at Catherine and Emily. Catherine stumbled, nearly losing her footing as she pulled her daughter close, shielding her from the oncoming storm. But she refused to let go. She couldn't stop now. With shaking hands, she held the pendant over the stone pedestal. It hummed with energy, a pulse of light that fought against the darkness surrounding them. "Do it," the voice roared. "You cannot escape." Catherine took a deep breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had no other choice. She had to finish this. She had to end it. With a final, determined motion, she placed the pendant onto the pedestal. The room erupted with a deafening, bone-shattering sound. The air crackled with energy, the walls shaking as if they were being torn apart. The shadows recoiled, screeching in pain as the light from the pendant flared to life, brighter than it had ever been. Catherine felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, the world spinning as the very fabric of reality seemed to warp and twist around them. The rift, the darkness, was closing, but the cost was becoming clear. The shadows surged, their forms twisting and contorting in agony. They fought against the light, but it was no use. The pendant was doing its job. The rift was closing, and yet Catherine could feel herself weakening. The energy that had powered the pendant was draining from her, draining from the very air around her. The darkness was retreating, but it was taking everything with it. "Mommy!" Emily's voice trembled, her small body clutching to her mother's side. She felt the pull of the darkness, the weight of the house's evil trying to drag them both down. "Mommy, I'm scared." Catherine's heart shattered. She wanted to tell her that everything was going to be okay, that they were safe. But she couldn't. She wasn't sure if they would make it out of this. The light from the pendant grew brighter still, the room beginning to crack and crumble under the force of the rift closing. The walls groaned, splitting apart, the floor buckling beneath them. Catherine clung to Emily, her body trembling as the house around them began to collapse, the darkness retreating with a final, deafening scream. And then, in a flash of blinding light, everything went silent. The silence was profound, an eerie stillness that blanketed everything. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, her ears ringing from the deafening roar that had filled the room moments before. She couldn't see, couldn't move, but she could still feel Emily's trembling body pressed against hers, the warmth of her daughter's breath on her skin. For a long moment, nothing happened. The oppressive weight of the house's malevolent presence had lifted, but so had everything else. There was no light, no sound, only an unbroken void. Catherine held her breath, straining to hear any sign of life, any hint that the nightmare had truly ended. But there was nothing, just the stillness, as if the entire world had been frozen in time. Slowly, cautiously, Catherine opened her eyes, blinking against the dark. She could see nothing but blackness at first, but as her vision adjusted, she realized that the shadows, those monstrous forms that had haunted her, were gone. The air felt lighter. The stifling presence of the house's curse was no longer pressing on her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without that crushing weight of fear. "Mommy?" Emily's voice was small, fragile, but it was there. Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand, relief flooding through her as she pulled her close. "We made it, Emily," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're safe." But even as she spoke the words, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, but not in the way it had been before. It was as if they had crossed into a different reality entirely, one where the rules of the world no longer applied. The floor beneath them was soft and uneven, like they were standing on ground that was somehow not real. "Where are we?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Is this the same place?" Catherine's stomach twisted. It didn't look like the house, not anymore. The walls were no longer cracked or decaying, and the oppressive weight of the shadows had lifted. But the room they stood in now was strange. The air shimmered faintly, as if the very atmosphere was alive with some otherworldly force. "I don't know," Catherine said softly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The room was bathed in a faint, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and shifted in the corners of her vision. The stone pedestal was gone, the pendant nowhere to be found. Had they really closed the rift? Had they truly stopped the darkness? She didn't know. All she knew was that they were no longer in the place they had just been. The house had changed, but the feeling of unease still lingered, thick and unsettling. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears, like a distant whisper. It was too faint to make out, but Catherine's senses immediately went on high alert. Her body tensed, ready for whatever might come next. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice a whisper. Catherine nodded, her heart rate picking up once more. "I hear it." The sound was growing louder, clearer now. It was unmistakable, a soft, slow scraping, like something dragging across the ground. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as the sound grew nearer, the faint whisper transforming into words. Words that were not meant for human ears. "You cannot escape." The voice, low and guttural, reverberated through the air like an echo from a place far beyond the physical world. Catherine's blood ran cold. The darkness might have retreated for now, but it hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been pushed back. She had hoped, prayed that it was over. But the house, or whatever this place was now, wasn't free from its influence. The curse, the rift, was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a way back in. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emily's voice trembled, her tiny body still pressed close to Catherine. She could feel her daughter's fear, her own reflected in Emily's eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine replied, forcing calm into her voice. "But we're going to be okay. We just need to stay together." The scraping sound grew louder, coming from all directions now. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, as if the very foundation of this place was shifting beneath their feet. Catherine could feel it, an unnatural presence closing in on them, its weight pressing down on her chest. The house had not let them go. It was not finished with them yet. A low rumble filled the air, like the earth itself was cracking open. The ground beneath them began to tremble, faint at first, then growing stronger with every passing second. Catherine reached down, grabbing Emily's hand with a vice-like grip. "We need to move," Catherine said urgently. Now. They had no time to think, no time to plan. They needed to leave before the house swallowed them whole once again. But as Catherine turned to find an exit, the walls began to shift, groaning and creaking as though they were alive, their surfaces rippling like water. From the far corner of the room, a figure emerged. At first, Catherine thought it was a trick of the light, but no, there was something moving toward them. Something dark, featureless, and ominous, its shape shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was tall, towering above them, its outline indistinct, but its presence undeniable. "You are mine." The voice again, louder this time, as if it were coming from the very air around them. The figure grew larger, its form becoming more solid, more defined. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as the figure took shape, revealing something hideous, something that was both human and not. Its face was distorted, an unnatural mask of agony, with eyes that seemed to burn with the weight of centuries of torment. "You will never escape me." The figure's voice was thunderous now, its tone filled with the wrath of an ancient power. The walls of the room began to close in, the space shrinking as the figure loomed closer. Its movements were slow but deliberate, and with every step it took, the room seemed to shrink further, its oppressive presence filling the space. "Mommy!" Emily cried, her voice breaking through Catherine's thoughts. "Mommy, what's happening?" Catherine didn't have an answer. She had no idea what this thing was, but she knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. It was part of whatever force had taken hold of the house, of the darkness that had followed them. It was a manifestation of the house's curse, and it wasn't going to let them go. "Stay with me, Emily," Catherine said, her voice filled with desperation. She pulled her daughter close, trying to shield her from the looming figure. "We have to get out of here." But as she spoke the words, the ground beneath them shook violently, and the figure advanced, its steps slow but inevitable. There was no escaping it. The house was not done with them yet. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, each step reverberating through the walls like thunder, shaking the very air around them. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned with a hollow, ancient malice. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. The room around them seemed to warp, bending and shifting in time with the figure's approach. "You cannot run." The voice boomed again, its tone dripping with malevolent glee. "You're a part of me now." Catherine's mind raced, desperately seeking an escape. She had no weapons, no means to fight this thing. All she had left was her daughter, and the pendant. The pendant. The thought shot through her like a bolt of lightning. She had placed it on the pedestal, but had it truly closed the rift? Was it really over? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the pendant, any hint that it still held power. But there was nothing. The pedestal was gone, the walls shifting as if the entire house were breathing. The entity, whatever it was, continued its slow advance, its form growing clearer with each passing second. Catherine had no choice. She had to make a stand. "Emily," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to move. Now." She turned toward the nearest doorway, her mind scrambling for a plan, a way out of this nightmare. The figure wasn't far behind, its presence suffocating, an oppressive weight that threatened to crush her very will to fight. With one final, desperate glance at the distorted shape moving toward them, Catherine grabbed Emily's hand and ran. The floor beneath them felt unstable, as if it were cracking under their feet with every step. The walls pressed in from all sides, the shifting shadows whispering their torment into Catherine's ears. She could feel the house closing in on them, the darkness and the malevolent force growing stronger with every passing moment. "You cannot escape, Catherine," the voice mocked, sending a chill down her spine. "You belong here." She pushed the words out of her mind. She couldn't think about that now. They had to get away, had to find some way to stop it. But every turn they took led them deeper into the labyrinthine house. The hallways twisted, the walls breathing around them. It felt as though they were walking in circles, trapped in some endless, maddening maze. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Catherine admitted, the desperation in her voice clear. "But we can't stop. We can't stop moving." The air grew colder, the walls tighter, until it felt as though they were running through an impossibly narrow tunnel. Catherine could barely see in front of her, the shadows swallowing up everything. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of something, a shadow darting across the corner of her vision, or a shape moving in the periphery. But every time she looked, there was nothing there. Then, just as she thought the walls might close in on them completely, they stumbled into a large, open space. The room was vast, stretching far into the distance. At the far end stood a massive stone archway, its surface etched with unfamiliar symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. The air was thick with the same unsettling hum that had filled the house since they first arrived, but now it was more pronounced, more oppressive. Without thinking, Catherine took Emily's hand and rushed toward the archway. The shadows were closing in, the figure not far behind, but for the first time, she felt a sliver of hope. If there was a way out, it had to be through this door. As they neared the archway, the hum in the air intensified, vibrating through the floor and up her spine. Catherine's footsteps faltered, her gaze falling on the intricate symbols that adorned the arch. They were the same symbols she had seen earlier, in the room with the pedestal, before everything had collapsed. "No," the voice echoed behind them, the figure's presence growing heavier. "You cannot leave." Catherine's breath quickened. The walls around them seemed to bend and warp, and the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. "Stay close to me, Emily," she whispered, pulling her daughter closer. They reached the archway, and as Catherine stepped forward, the air seemed to grow thicker, the shadows pressing in from all sides. But the moment they crossed beneath the arch, something shifted. A gust of wind howled through the space, the very air vibrating with energy. The shadows faltered, the figure's voice dying out for a moment as if held at bay by the arch's power. The room seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, drawing them in. Catherine and Emily stepped further into the archway, the energy in the air thickening with each step. And as they crossed completely into the unknown, the archway snapped shut behind them, sealing off the dark room they had left behind. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Catherine stood still for a moment, her pulse racing, as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The world around them had changed. The room was dimly lit, a soft, amber glow radiating from unseen sources. The shadows no longer pressed in on them, the oppressive weight lifting from their shoulders. They were no longer in the twisted, nightmarish version of the house. But where were they now? Catherine looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of the house, no sign of the darkness or the figure that had pursued them. They were in a place that seemed untouched by the horrors they had just faced. "Where are we, Mommy?" Emily asked, her voice small but filled with wonder. Catherine shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're safe for now." She hoped that was true. They had crossed some kind of threshold, stepping into a place that felt ancient, timeless even. The room around them was filled with strange symbols and intricate carvings, each one glowing softly with an otherworldly light. The air smelled faintly of incense, and the walls were covered in murals depicting scenes of ancient rituals and sacrifices. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to believe they might have escaped the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. But as she looked around the room, a thought whispered at the edge of her mind. Had they truly escaped? Or had they simply entered another layer of the same twisted reality? The air felt heavier now, though not in the same oppressive way it had before. It was a strange weight, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with ancient power. Catherine glanced around again, her eyes darting over the murals that adorned the walls. Each scene seemed to depict rituals, faces twisted in agony or reverence. Some figures were kneeling before a shadowy figure whose presence seemed to dominate the scenes, much like the entity that had pursued them through the house. "Mommy, what's all this?" Emily's voice cut through Catherine's thoughts. The little girl was staring up at the murals, her face pale and wide-eyed. Catherine hesitated, unsure of what to say. The place they had entered felt like a sanctuary, but something about it gnawed at her, a sense of foreboding that crept up her spine like a spider crawling along her back. "I'm not sure, Emily," she finally said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease building within her. "But we have to be careful. We don't know where we are." The glow from the symbols bathed the room in an eerie, golden light, and Catherine noticed a small altar in the center of the space. The altar was made of stone, worn smooth by the passage of time, and there were objects upon it: small, jagged stones, faded candles, and what looked like an ancient book. Her eyes lingered on the book for a moment. Its cover was cracked and weathered, but there was something about it that called to her, beckoning her closer. Without thinking, Catherine stepped forward, drawn toward it. She reached out and picked up the book, its weight solid and substantial in her hands. The cover was etched with more strange symbols, and as her fingers brushed over the surface, a chill ran through her. "Mommy, what's that?" Emily asked, her voice a little louder now, tinged with curiosity. Catherine held the book up, but instead of answering, she flipped it open. The pages were old, yellowed with age, but the text was still legible, written in a language she didn't recognize. Some of the words seemed familiar, as though they were in a language that belonged to another time, another world entirely. "Maybe it's a clue," Catherine murmured, her voice distant as she scanned the pages. But as she flipped through the ancient book, her eyes froze on a particular page. The symbols on it were different from the others, more elaborate, more intricate. And as her gaze followed the text, a horrifying realization began to dawn on her. The page depicted the very ritual that had brought them here, the same one from the murals. The figures on the page seemed to chant in unison, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways as they offered a sacrifice to the dark figure that loomed above them. The ritual described was not just some dark spell. It was a binding, a summoning, a contract with an entity from beyond. Catherine's stomach lurched. The house, the rift, the shadows, they had all been part of this. The entity they had encountered had not been chasing them randomly. It had been drawn to them, pulled by some unseen force. They had been chosen. "Mommy, are we in danger?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had noticed the shift in Catherine's expression, the way her mother's hands trembled as she held the book. Catherine forced herself to look away from the page, her heart hammering in her chest. "We're in a place connected to the curse," she said, her voice tight with fear. "But I don't know what it all means yet." Before Emily could respond, there was a sudden sound, low, guttural, like a breath being drawn from the depths of the earth. Catherine's blood ran cold as the sound reverberated through the room, the air growing heavy once more. It was then that she noticed the shadows again. They were not like before. These were no longer the amorphous shapes that had clung to the corners of the house. No, these were different. They were solid, moving, swirling around the room like smoke. They seemed to be drawn toward the altar, closing in on them. Catherine's heart raced. They were not alone. The shadows coalesced in the center of the room, swirling faster and faster until they formed a shape. A figure, one that towered over them. The darkness took form, a body of shadows, limbs elongating as if being stitched together by some unseen force. Then, with a final, sickening twist, the shadows solidified, and there, standing before them, was the entity. But it was different now. It was no longer the same distorted form it had been before, the one that had pursued them through the house. No, this was something far worse, far more powerful. The figure was fully formed, tall and imposing, a black void in the shape of a man. Its face was a mask of agony, eyes wide and unblinking, yet they seemed to gaze right through Catherine, as though seeing into her very soul. "You cannot escape me." The voice was a low, resounding growl that seemed to shake the air itself. It wasn't just spoken, it was felt. It reverberated through the walls, through the floor, through Catherine's very bones. Catherine stepped back, her grip tightening on Emily's hand. She needed to think, needed to act. But the room seemed to constrict with every passing moment, the shadows pressing in on them, the figure looming closer with every breath they took. "What do we do now?" Emily's voice was trembling, but there was no panic in it. She trusted Catherine, trusted that her mother would know what to do. Catherine didn't have an answer. The figure raised one long, skeletal hand, pointing directly at them. "You belong to me, Catherine." It was as if the entity had known her name, as if it had always known her. "You are the last piece, the final offering." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had read about such things, ancient rituals, sacrifices that bound individuals to dark powers. But never in her wildest nightmares had she imagined she would be the one caught in the web. "Stay close," Catherine whispered to Emily, though the words barely left her mouth. She had no idea what was going to happen next. She only knew that they couldn't let this thing win. The figure took another step forward, and Catherine's eyes locked onto the strange book in her hands. A sudden realization hit her like a tidal wave. The ritual, she could feel it. She could feel its power, its pull. It wasn't just a story. It was real. The book held the answer. She had to stop it. With trembling hands, Catherine opened the book again, her mind racing as she searched for the words. The ritual had to be completed, but she wasn't going to let it be completed in the way the entity wanted. She had to turn it on its head. But would it work? Would the power be enough to break the curse? Catherine's eyes raced over the page, her fingers trembling as they traced the symbols. She had to find it, some way to reverse this, to turn the power back on the entity. The book was her only hope. But the symbols seemed to blur in front of her, dancing in the dim light of the room, twisting like the shadows around them. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emily's voice trembled, but there was no fear in it now. She clung to Catherine's side, trusting her implicitly. Catherine clenched her teeth, her gaze darting from the book to the towering shadow before them. The entity was getting closer, its massive, dark form creeping toward them with terrifying slowness. It reached out one hand, its long fingers stretching toward Emily. Catherine's heart skipped a beat as the hand hovered over her daughter's head. "No!" Catherine screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She had to act now. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her mind racing. She thought back to the rituals, the words that had filled the book. There had been warnings. Warnings about the consequences of breaking the ritual, of disturbing the entity's bond with this world. The price was high, but Catherine was ready to pay it if it meant saving Emily. She read aloud, her voice steady but filled with purpose. The ancient words felt foreign, cold in her mouth, but as she spoke them, she felt the air around them change. The symbols in the book seemed to glow brighter, the ancient power stirring in response to her voice. And then, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The entity recoiled, its massive form shuddering, as if the very fabric of reality itself were being torn apart. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest. Was it working? Was she doing it right? But before she could finish the incantation, the entity's voice filled the room again. "You cannot defy me," it roared, the ground shaking as though the earth itself were being ripped apart. "You will pay the price for your defiance." Catherine's body trembled, the weight of the entity's anger pressing down on her like 1,000 pounds. The air thickened, suffocating them. She could feel the power building inside her, the energy of the ritual threatening to consume her. But she didn't stop. Her voice grew louder, more forceful. The words were spilling from her lips now, and she felt as if they were coming from somewhere deep inside her, as if something had awakened within her, something tied to the book, to the entity itself. And then a crack split the air. The world around them seemed to warp, reality itself bending and breaking as the entity let out a horrific, guttural scream. The shadows began to recede, pulling back from the altar, from Catherine and Emily. The entity's form flickered, its features distorting as though it were trying to maintain its shape, but was losing the battle. Catherine's hands shook as she finished the incantation. The book fell from her fingers, its pages fluttering in the stillness. The entity let out one final, terrible wail before it vanished, sucked back into the dark rift that had opened behind it. The shadows dissipated, and the room seemed to settle into an eerie calm. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Catherine felt her breath catch in her chest as she looked around. The room, this place, was still there, but the sense of doom that had filled it moments before was gone. It was as though the very air had lightened, and the power that had held them captive had been extinguished. "Mommy," Emily whispered, her voice soft with uncertainty. "Did we do it? Did we stop it?" Catherine slowly turned toward her daughter, her eyes wide with shock and relief. She didn't know. They had broken the ritual, but what had they done? Had they truly stopped the entity, or had they only pushed it away for now? I think we did," Catherine said, her voice hoarse, as she reached out and pulled Emily into her arms. But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. Was it truly over? Or was this just the beginning? Before she could voice her concerns, a cold wind swept through the room, stirring the air around them. It was as though the room were alive, breathing, and Catherine's heart sank. She had felt this before, the cold, the darkness, the sinister presence that had haunted them. Then, with a crack that split the air, the ground beneath them shook once more. The shadows returned, swirling around them in a frenzy, thicker and darker than before. The room seemed to bend and twist, its walls warping and shifting. And then, from the depths of the swirling darkness, the entity's voice returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You cannot escape me, Catherine," it boomed, its voice resonating in their bones. "You are mine." Catherine's heart raced. They had only delayed it. They hadn't defeated it. Not yet. "We need to go, Emily," she shouted, grabbing her daughter's hand. "We have to find a way out." The shadows closed in, the room disintegrating around them. Catherine had no plan, no escape route. The entity was growing stronger, and she could feel the pull of its presence. But then, through the swirling chaos, something caught her eye, a flicker of light. At the far end of the room, there was another door, a narrow passage leading out into the unknown. Without a second thought, Catherine yanked Emily toward it, her legs pounding against the shifting ground as they ran. The air grew colder, the shadows more oppressive, but the door was within reach. They reached it, just as the entity's voice rumbled in their ears again. "You cannot run from me forever." Catherine threw open the door, and they burst into the unknown, the world beyond the doorway swallowing them whole. Catherine and Emily burst through the door, stumbling into a new world, a dark, twisted forest where the trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath their feet was soft, almost spongy. It felt like the earth itself was alive, watching them, listening. Behind them, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the world beyond was suddenly gone. The silence was oppressive, heavy, and for a moment, Catherine allowed herself a breath, her heart still racing. But then she heard it, the low growl of the entity. It was distant but unmistakable, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emily's voice was small, filled with fear, but there was no panic in it. She was still trusting, still holding on to the hope that everything would be okay. Catherine couldn't lie to her. She couldn't give her false hope. "I don't know, sweetie," Catherine whispered, taking Emily's hand. "But we have to keep moving. Stay close." The forest around them was eerily still, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the damp ground. The mist swirled around them, twisting like tendrils of smoke, and every time Catherine looked around, the trees seemed to shift, to change their positions. The landscape was shifting. The world they had entered felt alive, and it didn't want them there. They had to find a way out. But how? The growl echoed again, closer this time. Catherine's heart thudded in her chest. There was no time. They had to move faster. "Mommy, look." Emily pointed toward a clearing up ahead, her eyes wide. Through the mist, Catherine saw it, a structure, a stone archway, as though it had been waiting for them. The entrance to something. It was their only hope. They ran toward it, the shadows of the trees stretching after them like fingers, reaching out to snatch them away. The entity was closing in, and Catherine could feel it in her bones. The book had given them no real answers, no real escape. They were caught in some twisted version of reality, some place that existed between worlds. But the archway, it had to be the answer. It had to be. They reached it, the stones cold beneath their hands as Catherine pressed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced behind her once more, and her heart nearly stopped. The entity was there, looming in the mist, its dark form a void of despair. "Emily, we need to go through the arch," Catherine urged, her voice filled with urgency. But Emily hesitated, her small frame trembling. "What if it's dangerous, Mommy? What if we can't come back?" Catherine's throat tightened. "We don't have a choice. We have to try." With one last look at the looming figure, Catherine grabbed Emily's hand and stepped through the arch. The world shifted violently as they passed through. The mist, the trees, the oppressive weight of the dark forest, it all disappeared in an instant. They were no longer in that twisted space. The air felt lighter, the ground solid beneath their feet. For the first time in what felt like forever, Catherine allowed herself to relax, her shoulders sagging with relief. They were in a new place, a small, quiet village. The streets were cobbled, the buildings were old but well kept, and the sun shone brightly overhead. It felt normal, almost too normal. But then Catherine noticed something. The people. They were walking around the village, but none of them seemed to notice her or Emily. They moved in a haze, as if they were part of the scenery, not truly alive. "Where are we?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Catherine's heart sank. She knew deep down that this wasn't truly an escape. This wasn't freedom. It was another place, another layer of reality, where they had been trapped once again. "Welcome home." The voice was behind them, chilling and familiar. Catherine turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The entity stood at the edge of the village, its massive form silhouetted against the setting sun. Its eyes burned with fury, its voice a thunderous growl. "You thought you could escape me?" And with that, the mist returned. The world around them began to distort, to crumble. The village faded into nothingness, and the shadows closed in once more. Final response. The entity was upon them. But Catherine knew deep down that this time was different. They were no longer alone. The connection between her and Emily, forged in the depths of fear and uncertainty, had given them the strength they needed. With a shout, Catherine grabbed Emily's hand, her resolve hardening. "We're not running anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "This ends now." The ground beneath them cracked open, and the entity roared in rage, its form flickering like a dying flame. But Catherine was no longer afraid. She focused on the book, the ancient knowledge it had given her, the power that had once been dormant within her. She recited the words, louder this time, her voice carrying through the collapsing world. And as the final syllable left her lips, the entity howled. The shadows retreated, the air grew still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the darkness was gone. Catherine and Emily stood in the quiet, the weight of the moment settling over them. The world was silent, save for the distant sound of birds chirping. They had won, but Catherine knew that this victory came at a cost. The world they had left behind would never be the same, and somewhere in the shadows the entity would wait, biding its time. But for now, Catherine held Emily close, knowing they had escaped. And that, for the moment, was enough. And this is the end of the story.